All right, looks like we are live, Matt. Welcome everybody to Standing For Truth. I am your host, Donny, and this is my co-host, Matt Man. I want to thank everybody for being here for tonight's important presentation and discussion on Neanderthals. More specifically, we are discussing Neanderthals best explained by creation or evolution. Matt, my good man, good to have you here, brother. How's it going? And why is this topic so important, would you say?
Good questions. Going good. Working on a couple big videos, and good new patron video is up for you guys. And we have this topic. There's a lot of confusion. A lot of people think that either they're a subhuman species, the Neanderthal. Christians might think that these are pre-Adamites, or maybe these people lived pre-flood. Others say they lived after. So there's a lot of confusions with the Neanderthal in both realms. So I think we can clear that up today. So that's one of the goals.
Amen, brother. We've done a ton on this topic. We've written on this topic, articles, and in our books, we've got whole sections on Neanderthals. We've done formal debates on this topic. You know, you've debated biblical longevity many times. I've had, I think, 3 formal debates on Neanderthals. And so for the audience, though, tonight is going to be the most comprehensive video on the internet when it comes to Neanderthal. So that is our goal tonight. We will probably be going between 2 and 2.5 hours. And as Matt pointed out, we are working overtime for everybody. We are working on some upcoming videos as well as books and movies. And as you can see in the pinned comment, in the comment section, for any new patron, I should say, which you can be a patron for as little as $1 a month. We will send you 3 free PDFs of any of the books that we have. I think we've written now about 12 as a team. So if you're a patron, just shoot me an email, or a new patron, and we will send you those books as appreciation. So also the debate between Dr. Dino and James W., that has been rescheduled for tomorrow. So we've got another busy week of main events. Tomorrow is going to be Dr. Dino and James W. Then the next day, we're going to be having Dr. Ken Colson here to discuss dinosaur soft tissue. He is going to be having a presentation that you are not going to want to miss. This is going to be awesome. Then we're going to have an audience Q&A. And then on the 18th, we have the much anticipated debate, the debate you've all been waiting for on Sola Fide. 2 powerhouses in the debate world, Dr. Robert Sungenis, world famous Catholic apologist, and Kelly Powers. Does the Bible teach salvation is by faith alone? That one's on the 18th. Then first thing next week, Chris Date and Dr. Shabir Ali, they are going to be debating, does the New Testament teach Jesus is God? Also, what we're doing right now on our Patreon, we've got a couple new series. Our first episode of creation moments. We just put out the first little episode titled, if I'm not mistaken, Matt, From Creation Till the Flood, from creation to Noah's flood. And then we're also doing audiobooks. So currently, I believe I'm on part 5 or 6 of the Independent Origins Handbook. And then when this is done, we'll kind of clip them all together. So we'll have one big audiobook. We're going to try and do this with the rest of our books, and then the Human Evolution Handbook that hopefully is out in the next few months. So we will do the same for that as well. So lots to do, lots going on this channel. And if you want to support us, Patreon is a fantastic way to do so. So what we're going to be doing tonight, right, Matt? We're going to be having myself. I'm going to give a presentation. I've got about 80 slides to get to, but I'm going to give myself a time limit. I'm going to go for about an hour. So we're going to go through a ton of information on Neanderthals and leave no stone unturned, essentially. And then Matt's going to give his presentation, which, as always, will be fantastic and information driven and packed. And then we're going to have kind of a discussion just between me and Matt on some of the more common arguments against the position that we are going to be laying out tonight. We'll discuss those to really leave no stone unturned, and we'll also take some audience questions. So I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be fun. Matt, any words from you, brother, before we get the party started?
No, this is going to be fun. I guess if there's any questions from the audience, I don't know how we'll gather them doing presentations and all, but stay till the end, and then whatever questions you guys might have, post them then, so we can actually just look. Because posting them now, I'm not watching chat, and you won't be giving your presentation. So.
Yeah, usually, we've got a presenter, a lecturer, and then, either Matt or myself are not giving the presentation, so we'll take questions. Today, it's us giving the presentation. So, guys, wait until after, let's say, the first presentation from myself. Send in some questions. I'll save those. So point is, let's wait till closer to the end so we don't miss your questions. But as always, the chats are lively, and we appreciate that. We appreciate the engagement we get. So as long as audio and video is good, I will share screen and let the fun begin. Matt, one question before we get started. We'll get this since we have Mitchell, who is a faithful member of the channel. He's got a question for you, since your expertise is health and nutrition, vitamins. He says, off-note question for Brother Matt concerning ashwagandha root encapsulated form. Are they good to take? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, just make sure that, ashwagandha is active ingredient is a saponin, so you would need to make sure that it's an extract form. So otherwise it won't be very potent. And there are different doses to take, but remember, ashwagandha is considered a superior class herb. There's only 60 of these, so you can take as many as you want. It's not toxic. Your body will see it as just food. And I would say take it in between meals. That way you'll get more potency out of it. And try to take it alone, maybe with just a little bit of water, and that would be the most medicinal form you can take. And now, if you're going out to Starbucks, another good time to take it, because caffeine will act as a catalyst and drive it into the cells. And because ashwagandha is mostly for the brain and memory, then it would be very good to be taking with something like caffeine. It will enhance the properties and the ability to pass the blood-brain barrier. So I do like it. I think it's great. You can have it as a tea, capsule, powder, or food if you grow it. It's good in all forms.
Well, I appreciate that, Matt. And Ryan Daniel, our brother, says, where is Matt that it should be so warm and bright where he is? Well, Matt is actually currently streaming from the pre-flood world. So very cool. And it's snowing where I am. It's freezing where I am, but it's perfect where Matt is. So Matt,
yeah, I'm in the desert.
Brother.
I'm in California. I'm in the desert. So yes, it is really hot everywhere. I was going to give you a little view, but it's really nice out here.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I couldn't even imagine being outside right now in a t-shirt. I'd be like completely frozen right now.
Well, soon it'll be 120.
Oh, fun stuff. All right. Actually, SWE, she caught us. You're not in the pre-flood world. You're in the dark side of the moon. So
that's okay.
All right. That being said, let's get this party started, everybody. We got a lot of information to get through, and this is going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it. Matt, if there's ever any issues on my end, just let me know. And the audio wise, but it should be good. And so here we go. Neanderthals best explained by creation or evolution, by Donny from Standing For Truth Ministries. And of course, Matt is here to give his presentation as well. We've written, I believe, over a dozen books pertaining to the creation evolution debate and ancestry, specifically in refuting the critics of biblical creation. This one here, and special creation, dismantling evolution, confirming independent origins. We have two very lengthy and detailed chapters on Neanderthals. So check those out. Actually, the chapter from Special Creation is up on our Creationist Clothing website and our official website, standingfortruthministries.com, where you can read the chapter in article form. I'm also working on a human evolution handbook, very thorough and comprehensive. Definitely takes a lot of work and energy, because here on Standing For Truth Ministries, as everybody knows, we like to leave no stone unturned. So, there's no point in writing a book, an up-to-date book on human evolution, without also refuting and addressing the most common and lesser known arguments from the critics today. So it is going to be a very comprehensive book. So we're working on that currently. Now, let's get kind of right into it. The ape to man evolutionary story, guys, it's constantly changing. The tree for human evolution is now extremely bushy and convoluted. And a lot of the examples that you see here, down into Ardipithecus ramidus and into the Homo genus, right? Neanderthal ancestors, which we're focusing on today, the Denisovans, erectus, habilis, naledi, floresiensis, Australopithecus sediba. We're going to be doing presentations on all of these. So today we're primarily focusing on Neanderthal ancestors, which is up here, but we will eventually be doing presentations on all of these. So rather than a tree, we are looking at a human evolution bush where we get a constant shifting of the ape to man icons. The field of paleoanthropology is contested. It is fragmented. Okay. Any line of evidence, or let's say preferred example of a transitional form, or that which may be assumed to be primitive, you're going to have another paleoanthropologist who contests it, who would disagree with the conclusions from another paleoanthropologist. So the field is contested, it's fragmented. Every find is contested, is a safe way to put it. The field is fragmented, just like the fossil evidence. Guys, we frequently point out that the fossil record is low confidence and low quality science. It's not the best way to answer this question of ancestry, right? Genetics, genes, and traits. That's what's inherited sperm and egg. Not a fossil, not a bone fragment, not a bone found in the dirt, not geology, not geography. No, genes and traits are what's inherited sperm and egg. Because the fossil record is scant, it's scattered, and the opinions and the understandings of the various scientists in the field are also scattered, just like the fossil evidence. If you want to see just how much of a mess the current understanding of human evolution is, take a little bit of time to watch their in-house dialogues, discussions, even debates, where it gets pretty opinionated and oftentimes heated. Especially when you watch their lectures, they will very frequently admit just how much the story is changing. It's ever changing, and just how much they really don't know. There's a lot of hypotheses that go untested, and you can also find this in their technical papers as well. Now, as you can see here, complex and bushy. So we're kind of just setting the stage for human evolution before we get specifically into Neanderthals. The story of human evolution is not one of neat, linear progression with a concrete beginning and end. Instead, it is a tale of a family tree whose complex and bushy branches stretch over many millennia and continents. It features a changing cast of ancient hominin relatives, evolutionary dead ends, and many unknowns. Adaptation, survival, and extinction provide the dynamic backdrop of this story. Before I continue, though, I just want to make sure that everything at this point is coming in smooth. So I'm going to give a little look at the chat. And okay, perfect. Looks like it's good. I appreciate that, guys. Now, another thing, too, is we should be finding a series of countless, limitless, irrefutable fossils going from an ape-like creature to man. But this is not what we find. We have a few interesting candidates that we could debate for hours and hours. But other than those few curious candidates, there isn't much in terms of evidence for ape-to-man evolution. There are huge gaps in the fossil record, and scientists in the field hope for future discoveries to help finally understand the human evolution story. We should have swimming pools worth of fossil evidence for ape to man evolution. And yet what we find is far less than that. Even their best so-called examples are contested, right? Two more familiar examples that are often held up as, the single best examples of a transitional form is Australopithecus sediba and Homo habilis. And yet there's those in the field of paleoanthropology that are confident enough in saying that these are cases of artificial species. We're dealing with wastebasket taxon. So even their best so-called examples of a transitional form is contested. It's very very opinionated in the field. Human evolution is a puzzle with thousands of fossil species and billions of DNA fragments. As new fossils continue to be uncovered and added to the human family tree, new dating techniques and climate data are providing a more accurate picture of the conditions in which our ancient relatives evolved. Improved DNA techniques will help determine where each species fits within the family tree and give us further insights into recent and ongoing human evolution. Here's where it's interesting, guys. We as young earth creationists, we as proponents of separate ancestry, we would agree that it's in our DNA, it's genetics that is the direct way of answering these important questions. And it's in genetics where we can make the best testable predictions. And specifically focusing on Neanderthals tonight, you're going to see why the DNA evidence is really so amazingly consistent and in support of the biblical creation model. As you can see here, we are going to refer to this a lot in our ongoing series in terms of these presentations, where we can using the fossil data, as limited as it is, but also, and especially using the genetic data, we can determine what is and what isn't related. Okay. We can draw a line essentially in ancestry. And we've done that, especially in genetics, looking at mutation rates in the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, right? These uniparentally inherited DNA compartments. And also looking at the autosomal DNA, these the DNA compartment that is biparentally inherited DNA. We can look to DNA function. We can look to linkage blocks, and we can determine, what is and what isn't related. And we've determined that humans are not related to supposedly our closest cousins, the chimpanzee. And we will be touching on all of these examples. As you can see here, the separate ancestry model, we can safely conclude that we've got the human group, the ape-like or Australopithecine group, and of course the wastebasket taxon group. And today, right here, Homo neanderthalensis is what we are going to be focusing on, as well as little bits and pieces of the others. But as I've stated earlier, we will be having a longer and more in-depth presentations on the other examples. The separate ancestry model. The fossils we have for human evolution are either fully human, degenerate human, fully ape, degenerate ape, a wastebasket, a taxon, or artificial species. What's interesting is you don't actually find too many examples of the ape ancestors in, let's say, the chimpanzee line or the gorilla line or the orangutan line. And it's interesting because nobody remembers the 10th guy who found a Tyrannosaurus Rex fossil or a Stegosaurus fossil, right? They remember the first guy or the second guy. And that's why these paleoanthropologists, the field is so competitive. They're not really looking for examples or candidates for the other lines in terms of the non-human apes or primates. Everybody wants to find the next big link or so-called transitional form in the human line. And I believe that's why we find very few examples of the ape line in terms of, what the evolutionists say are our relatives, the chimpanzee, bonobo, gorillas, orangutan, so on and so forth. So guys, the field of human evolution, it's in crisis. Okay. A lot of the internet, YouTube evolutionists, they don't want to admit this, but they're in denial. And you can see this in, as I've pointed out, their dialogues, lectures, technical papers. And although I am sure paleoanthropologists would have loved and preferred if the story of human evolution from the fossil record would be smooth and clear, the experts in the field describe it as a messy and tangled bush. These words, messy and tangled, are used frequently. The human evolution tree is a bush that is out of control, especially because those that would be referred to as splitters, right? We got splitters and lumpers. The splitters like to take any little morphological variation and use that to say what we're looking at is a new species, a separate species. While lumpers would say, no, this is variation within, the same species. And this would kind of help us differentiate between those that believe Homo neanderthalensis is the same species as us, humans, Homo sapiens, maybe a subspecies, they would say, rather than a completely separate species, a sister species. And so, there's that problem, especially because today we know there oftentimes exists more variation within the same species than between species or across species. That's why the fossil record, bone found in the dirt, especially if we're just looking at anatomy and morphology, it can be very deceiving. More experts in the field are saying much of what has been understood in the past on the names and research done on human evolution needs to be scrapped or reinterpreted. So as we can see here, figure 2, Bernard Wood's latest tree diagram raises more questions than tree diagrams made over 20 years ago. Wood acknowledges that the hominin fossil record is more convoluted than ever before and still fails to show any hint of a discernible ape-to-man progression. We're going to go over a few quotes from some famous paleoanthropologists that I think perfectly demonstrates what we're dealing with here in terms of just how contested the field of paleoanthropology is. So here's Bernard Wood, 50 years after Homo habilis. Even with all the fossil evidence and analytical techniques from the past 50 years, a convincing hypothesis for the origin of Homo remains what? Remains elusive. Notice this paper, the Pliocene hominin diversity conundrum. Do more fossils mean less clarity? Read the paper. And what we see in terms of conclusions is that the story of human evolution, it's not any more clear. It's less clear. It's messy, bushy. Here's a fascinating paper. From Australopithecus to Homo, the transition that never was. Although the transition from Australopithecus to Homo is usually thought of as a momentous transformation, the fossil record bearing on the origin and earliest evolution of Homo is virtually undocumented. The fossil record bearing on the ancestry of Pleistocene Homo is what? Is poor. Guys, we're dealing with low quality and low confidence data, and fossils are fickle. And a fossil can sing any song that you want it to. Although there is no doubt that these new fossil discoveries have opened new windows into our evolutionary past, they have also complicated our understanding of early hominin taxonomy and phylogenetic relationships. Notice this, guys. Nevertheless, paleoanthropologists continually seek more fossils. We just need more fossils, guys. And then we'll finally understand the evolution of our species. Most hominin fossils, even though they serve as a basis for endless speculation and elaborate storytelling, are fragments of jaws and scraps of skulls. And this is so true. It's funny because a lot of critics, they'll say, oh, this is a quote from, Stephen Jay Gould back in 1980. What a quote mine. This is outdated. No, they're saying the same things today. Okay. I was just watching a lecture from Lee Berger, who was admitting the same thing. Most of what we're dealing with in terms of the fossil record is scraps, fragments, and little pieces of bone. Schwartz and Tattersall defining the genus Homo. This one's a fascinating one as well. If we want to be objective, we shall almost certainly have to scrap the iconic list of names. Just scrap them all. Let's start from the beginning, in which hominin fossil specimens have historically been trapped, and start from the beginning by hypothesizing morphs, building testable theories of relatedness, and rethinking genera and species. Guys, so much has changed in 100 years. Okay, picture people 50, 60 years ago that were sucked into the story of human evolution, okay, based on certain lines of evidence that have been overturned today. that even those in the field of paleoanthropology would say, no, we had the wrong understanding there. That was a failed prediction. We have to rethink that. And yet these are many lines of evidence that in the past, many people were suckered into the story of human evolution because of, a line of evidence that's been overturned today. And it's kind of a sad state of affairs. And that's why I like to point out, do we put our faith and trust in the wisdom of man or in the power of God? Notice this from Nigel Hawkes. Few sciences produce such abundant returns from so few fragments of fact as paleontology. How's the audio coming in, guys? I'm checking for my phone, make sure it's all good. This is some important stuff right here, guys. Again, fossil find of the century may just be a gorilla after all. Because remember, they're not really looking for the candidates. They're not looking for, the best or next big missing link from the chimpanzee line, gorilla line. No, they all want to find the link. I appreciate that, Mitchell and Andrew and Jerome. Okay, so, they're not really looking for examples in the line of, let's say, the chimpanzee. They want to find examples in the line of humans. Okay, and that's why it's so competitive. And they'll look at a fragment or an isolated bone and say, look at this. Look at this hominid, this new species, a Homo, when in fact it may just be an ancestor of the gorillas, an ancestor of the chimpanzees, orangutans, for example. Sahelanthropus. Study of a partial femur, left femur, suggests Sahelanthropus chigensis was not a hominin after all, while others suggest it was nothing more than an ancient ape. Here's a few more quotes, guys. All new discoveries make things more confusing. The transition to Homo continues to be almost totally confusing. What a mess early Homo is. This is actually a specific slide that I got from a technical presentation from Christopher Roop. So I highly recommend the book Contested Bones. And I recommend it more than ever now that I've seen the lousy, unsophisticated, unintelligent rebuttals and responses from the critics and skeptics. It just goes to show how powerful the evidence is presented in Contested Bones. So if you've read the book Contested Bones, let's do our brother here, Christopher Roop, a favor and leave him a solid review, because it really is a solid book and he deserves it. So here we go, guys. The separation of man and apes. Paleoanthropologist Leslie Aiello, who served as head of the anthropology department at University College London, stated that when it comes to locomotion, Australopithecines are like apes and the Homo group are like humans. Something major occurred when Homo evolved, and it just wasn't in the brain. And of course, in future presentations, we're going to get more specifically into some of the examples of the Australopithecines, like Afarensis and even Sediba. Okay, but it's important to understand, guys, when we have a good amount of the bones or even the DNA, which we have the DNA of Neanderthals as we kind of hone in here on Neanderthals more specifically, we can easily tell if what we are looking at is ape or human, or Australopithecine or human. When we are dealing with disarticulated bones and fragments, it becomes more difficult to distinguish, especially since we do know there exists what is called artificial species or chimeric species. This is not a conspiracy. This is well known and well understood, okay? Even a recent video series that Lee Berger has been doing, he pointed out that Afarensis is probably a chimeric species. Afarensis isn't just one species, it's a mixture of multiple different species. Okay, whenever we find intact and well-preserved specimens, we can determine if this is a human or an ape. Now, firstly, as we get into Neanderthals here, genetic data has actually revealed that we as humans have mated with the so-called ancient humans. These would be Neanderthals and the Denisovans. It is understood that roughly 4% of the DNA of modern of Europeans, okay, is shared with Neanderthals. Again, this means modern day humans have interbred with Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Was this predicted by the evolutionary model? Of course not. This was actually predicted, though, by young Earth creationists. And unfortunately, old Earth creationist organizations and ministries, they have not tapped out on this. They will now put forth a weird model of bestiality that Neanderthals which cannot be defended. And we're going to show you why in this presentation. Neanderthals were just an animal. Okay, I know reasons to believe holds to this. And so the reason why, if we do have their DNA and interbred with them, it was because of bestiality, which is interesting that we can produce fertile offspring from that. So unfortunately, not only the evolutionists, but also a lot of old Earth proponents have not tapped out or admitted that, okay, yeah, we were wrong on Neanderthals. Now look at this. Have a look at what was once assumed to be Neanderthal by the evolutionary community. Earlier reconstructions portray Neanderthals as a brutish, subhuman species. Newer museum displays are replacing the outdated representations in keeping with the latest DNA analyses. Neanderthal replacement displays appear more modern in appearance. I was just watching a lecture from Dr. Jerry Bergman, okay, world famous young Earth creationist. He's a genius, he's got like a dozen degrees. I've been chatting with him through email, and we're actually going to be having him on within the next month or so. And for specifically on this topic of human evolution, he was showing pictures from old textbooks where they actually had like a gorilla on the far left, Neanderthal who they had drawn or illustrated or represented more like this, and then a modern human at the end, right? Gorilla with the intermediate being the gorilla man, and then modern Homo sapiens. And people believe this. People believe this, unfortunately. They were suckered into human evolution based on misunderstandings, based on wrong interpretations of the data. Have a look at this, guys. Scientifically accurate Homo Neanderthal ancestor, modeled by Kennis and Kennis. And of course, Neanderthals survived in Europe until the species went extinct according to the evolutionary model, 39,000 years ago. Here we can see some of the cranial features that differentiate modern man and Neanderthals: the brain case shape, the forehead, the brow ridge, of course, right here on the Neanderthal, nasal bone projection, cheekbone angulation, the chin, occipital, the bun. Back here. Essentially, Neanderthals were massive. They were robust, and they were built seemingly for the cold post-flood ice age related conditions that they lived in. Their musculature and bone structure were huge. I was watching a lecture that we actually posted a clip of in our Patreon, a very up-to-date lecture in the speaker, the lecturer was pointing out firstly, that Neanderthals were us. They're not a separate species. This is a secular scientist. So anybody who's a patron of the channel has seen this clip, and it's just fascinating. Neanderthals were us, and you can't defend the idea that they were a separate species anymore. But he also explained that nearly all Neanderthal fossils that you find actually have broken bones somewhere in the body. And this also goes for the female Neanderthals, which means they were hunting together. And these are bones that broke and then were healed. And we see the evidence, as I pointed out, of this in both Neanderthals and women. So they were working together when it came to feeding their families, hunting these animals. And they lived in cruel, cold environments where they wrestled and killed animals for food. They lived in small populations, and as a result, they were actually inbred. If you have a look at their runs of homozygosity, they're massive. And we're going to get into that a little bit more as to why that's important here in the creation versus evolution debate. But it also turns out that they were better than us in a lot of ways as well. And that would also make sense since they would be closer to the flood. They would be an earlier branch of man, okay? So they were better than us in many ways. They had better eyesight than us, bigger brains than us. They were stronger than us. And experts in the field would now admit that they were the same species as us, as I pointed out. Not a different species, no, the same species. So right here, the postcranial morphology of Neanderthals suggests an adaptation. You can notice the shorter legs that we have here. An adaptation to the cold climate of Europe, as their limbs, especially their distal limbs, follow what's called, so there's a certain rule called the Bergman's rule, okay? And these rules state that those living in colder climates tend to have larger bodies, but then shorter limbs. And this is to retain heat. retain body heat given the environment they lived in, the cold glacial environment. Humans today living in cold areas, we see this today, such as Northern Europe, Alaska, and anywhere near the Arctic Circle, follow these same rules. They have large bodies and shorter limbs. Those living in more temperate climates, such as near the equator, tend to have smaller bodies and longer limbs. Guys, after the flood, and especially after the Tower of Babel event, we have different people groups moving to different parts of the world, okay, simply based on environmental related adaptation or epigenetics. We can have these changes in morphology, okay, that don't result in a new species. It's a new environment that's manifesting these adaptations. And they can come about quickly. And we see that in numerous technical papers today that focus on epigenetic changes. The fact that we got these millions of genetic switches in our genetics just waiting to be turned on via environment, rapid adaptation to new environment, which makes sense from the design diversity perspective or starting point, that creatures would require ever-changing genomes because they live in ever-changing environments. If genomes were static, that wouldn't make any sense because we'd have immediate extinction. Their short, stocky physiques were suited to cold environments. The bulky trunk, in addition to their short lower leg and lower arm bones, gave Neanderthals proportions that would have minimized the skin's surface area, presumably to conserve heat under the predominantly colder conditions of the last 200,000 years. Again, of course, the dates, these are sources from the secular literature. Some researchers argue that this physique also gave the Neanderthals greater power in their arms and legs for close range ambushes during hunting. Put it this way, these Neanderthal populations would have been perfect football players. Okay, they would have been superstars. Again, as you've seen in the picture earlier, Neanderthals had a long, low skull compared to the more compared to the skull of modern humans, okay? With a characteristic prominent brow ridge above their eyes. This is probably what people are more familiar with. And also they had a bell-shaped rib cage, okay, guys? This means that their rib cage flares out at the bottom. While today, we have a barrel-shaped rib cage, right? Ours goes straight up and down, okay? And Neanderthals don't actually have much of a forehead, nor do they have much of a chin. They really don't have any chin. And their brain was a lot bigger than ours as well, which is interesting. We know that, and we're going to get into this later, Neanderthals also painted in caves. Okay, they had controlled use of fire, musical instruments, buried their dead ceremonially, and this is all evidence that they were a sophisticated people group. Their face was also very distinctive. The central part of the face protruded forward and was dominated by a very big, wide nose. Some scientists think this feature may have been an adaptation, again, to living in colder, drier environments, especially with the rapid post-flood ice age, based on what we know of epigenetics and the way environment can shape phenotype. Based on the underlying genotype, of course, rapid adaptation to these environments would make a lot of sense from the biblical creation perspective. And we're going to get more into that later. The large internal volume of the nose would have acted to moisten and warm the air they breathed. Their front teeth were large, and scratch marks show they were regularly used like a third hand when preparing food and other materials. Unlike modern humans, Neanderthals didn't have much of a chin. Neanderthals had strong muscular bodies and wide hips and shoulders. You guys seen that in the picture earlier. Adults grew to about 1.50 to 1.75 meters tall and weighed about 64 to 82 kilograms. And early Neanderthals were taller on average than later Neanderthals, which would make sense. The early Neanderthals would be the less inbred form. What we have today in terms of the genetics, we're looking at the end stage Neanderthal. The Neanderthal that has the most runs of homozygosity, the Neanderthal that's the most inbred. Okay, the Neanderthals would, we can differentiate them from other examples of, let's say, reductive evolution, like the Hobbit, Naledi, Luzonensis, Erectus. We can differentiate them from those cases of reductive evolution and isolation, because Neanderthals aren't just due to, their morphology, their genetics, their phenotype, the physical features. are not just due to inbreeding, loss of fitness over time, deleterious mutation accumulation. It's a mix of longevity, right? They probably would have retained much of their longevity genes that they would have inherited from, the immediate post-flood ancestors off of the ark. Over time, those longevity genes have been destroyed. Obviously, Matt here's the expert on that topic. He's given presentations on that in the past, but also the result of adaptation to new environments and the end stage Neanderthal. The early stage Neanderthal probably being Heidelbergensis, which even Lee Berger would say some in the Heidelbergensis group probably grew to 7+ feet tall. Okay. But today, what we're looking at in terms of the end stage Neanderthal is a group of people, subgroup of people that, although sophisticated, well adapted, and retaining some of their longevity genes, which is why in a lot of ways they were better than us. They were also highly, highly inbred, as you can see here, 40% less reproductively fit than modern humans. The Neanderthal genome included harmful mutations that made the hominids around 40% less reproductively fit than modern humans. Non-African humans inherited some of this genetic burden when they interbred with Neanderthals. The genetic cost of Neanderthal introgression. I mean, there's paper after paper on this. Recent studies have shown that this Neanderthal DNA is depleted around functional genomic regions, and you can read this all for yourself. Neanderthals were one of the first, if not the first, people group to move up into Europe and Asia after the flood. Okay. This is what the data seems to suggest. And this is why the biblical creation model far better explains what we know about the Neanderthal than the evolutionary deep time model. They achieved a large population size. And because of the conditions they lived in, these cold ecoglacial related conditions, the fact that they became isolated, they were split. Remember, Neanderthals are just a subset of the group that came off of the ark. And so are we, modern Homo sapiens. So they always struggled. You would not want to live in the conditions and environments that they live. We would not survive today. They lived off the land. They hunted and were constantly faced with stressful environmental related conditions. Every day was a battle, I'm sure. Okay, hunting for food, taking care of their family. The fact that you can see this in their bones, the fact that nearly all examples of Neanderthals, their bones were broken and then healed in both women and men. As the post-flood ice age subsided or ended, came to a close, and things started warming up, people moved in and started farming. Farm equals what? Farm equals food, and food equals larger populations, more healthy people groups. Larger populations probably ran into smaller Neanderthal populations, because by the end stage Neanderthal, highly inbred, small groups, small tribes. As I pointed out, the runs of homozygosity, which means they had these massive runs of identical letters. I mean, today we have probably, 3 million differences in our genetics. We actually just individually, we have a great amount of the world's diversity. We are actually heterozygous at quite a few DNA sites, while the Neanderthals mostly had identical letters all throughout. They were marrying their sisters, close relatives. This would lead to rapid genetic degeneration. This is just well understood. And what may have happened when these larger populations ran into smaller Neanderthal populations was what humans do, unfortunately. War, conquest, assimilation. We know that based on the fact that we have their genes, right? So they just might have assimilated with us, modern Homo sapiens. And also, a finger bone in a cave in Siberia was analyzed for DNA, and the sequence was different than modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthal. Well, what was this? We kind of mentioned it earlier, but this would be the Denisovans. And that means we have another group of people, and this group of people's DNA is found in people today. So we interbred with them as well, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern Homo sapiens. Nearly 10% of some people today are made up of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. Guys, it can't be argued against. Neanderthals were human beings. Denisovans were human beings. Notice this: Neanderthal behavioral practices and abilities. And you can go through these. There's abstract thinking, human language, strategic hunting, planning and foresight, sewing, cosmetics. They were into jewelry. They had evidence for spirituality, the way that they buried their dead. Musical instruments. We have an example of these bone flutes. They were into art, symbolic communication. And another thing, too, is the fact that Neanderthals had the same kind of hyoid bone that we today as humans have in our larynx that allows for sophisticated language. I mean, that's amazing. Because of this bone, we can speak and articulate. Chimpanzees and other primates do not have the same type of hyoid bone that we and the Neanderthals do. There's massive discontinuities and gaps in the fossil record when it comes to ape-like creatures to humans. Hyoid bone, the baculum, of course, and a number of other things are just a few examples of these massive gaps. And this gives us really, really, really good reason to believe that Neanderthals could indeed talk. They were a sophisticated people group. Neanderthals were skilled tool makers, as evidenced by excavated objects such as spears and flint hand axes. Neanderthals, throughout their history, actually developed an innovative stone technology. Okay, it was this very specific technique that involved making pre-shaped stone cores that could be finessed into a finished tool at a later time. It meant Neanderthals were free to travel away from sources of raw material and yet be able to make tools when needed. They had evidence for purposeful navigation. They had boats, and they went fishing and ate open water tuna. I mean, and I keep pointing to the old Earth creationists that want to say that it's not defensible. You're going to try and say that what kind of animals today have purposeful navigation, buried their dead, into jewelry, had these sophisticated techniques of making stone tools and weapons and things like that. It can't be defended to say that they're just beasts, animals. No, they're human in every way. We know from injuries found on their prey, such as mammoths, bison, and reindeer, that Neanderthals were proficient hunters, intelligent and able to communicate. Healed and unhealed bone damage, we covered this earlier, found on Neanderthals themselves suggests they killed large animals at close range. A risky strategy that would have required considerable skill, strength, and bravery. This stuff's fascinating, guys. Despite their reputation as being primitive cavemen, and we pointed that out, that over time, the evolutionary community has kind of had to shift towards the understanding today based on the data and the facts that no, Neanderthals were a sophisticated people group. They were actually very intelligent and accomplished humans. These were no ape men. So it's unfair to them that the word Neanderthal is used as an insult today. Gets into the brain size. We touched that earlier. Here's something interesting. Neanderthals also developed the ability to make fire from at least 200,000 years ago. Again, based on the secular time frame, of course. This is just showing that these sources, the majority of these sources, are from the evolutionary literature itself. I mean, they've had to tap out and accept the data for what it is. Life was hard, but these people were very resourceful. Archaeological evidence shows that some Neanderthals looked after their sick and buried their dead, which suggests they were social and even compassionate beings. Notice this. Let's see, click here. An elaborate burial right here of a presumed Neanderthal found in Russia. The 60-year-old male was decorated with hundreds of mammoth ivory beads sewn onto leather, mammoth tusk, ivory bracelets, necklaces, and pendants of shell and animal teeth. He wore a leather cap, pants, and knee-high boots. 2 children buried nearby were also extravagantly adorned. I mean, have a look at this picture. It's you have evidence for spirituality just through the way they buried their dead. Just one more fascinating line of evidence. The evidence is overwhelming. Neanderthals in every way were human. These miniature things that they built. Flute, example of a instrument, musical instrument right here. These researchers find it hard to believe that they were formed by accident. This flute right here, this is the flute that was discovered in a cave. It is regarded as the world's oldest musical instrument. The Neanderthal flute is believed, according to secular time frame, to be 50 to 60,000 years old. It was made from a cave bear's thigh bone. However, some paleo experts find it hard to believe Neanderthals were so sophisticated to play music. They argue the instrument is really just a bone chewed on by hyenas. I mean, do you see the desperation? And I would guess that those maybe older creationist theistic evolutionists don't want to say Neanderthals were just animals or beasts. They'd have to resort to the same rescue device. Okay. This hyena hypothesis has mostly been rejected by other researchers. Musicologists have found that the spacing of the holes reflects a recognizable musical scale. End of story. This didn't happen by accident. This figurine right here, this carving of a horse figurine right here made by these Neanderthals, just an animal, just a beast. Although the evolutionists would just say we're animals too. But they'd have to admit that a Neanderthal was a sophisticated animal, apparently. Its technological perfection points to high cognitive abilities of Neanderthals. Reconstructions of the Neanderthal flute make a beautiful sound. An impressive figurine carving of a horse that was recovered in another cave in Germany. And here's why we actually have the preserved DNA for the most part, is because of where the Neanderthals lived often. Not all of them did, but some lived in caves. And therefore, we have the perfect type of environment to preserve some of this DNA. So I believe it is legit. We can get some good information from it. Other figurines, so there's been multiple figurines found of Ice Age mammals: bison, reindeer, lion, mammoth, woolly rhino. Probably making these figurines for their kids, just like we today give our kids toys. However, a more recent study published in Nature casts doubt on these earlier claims and raises the possibility that the figurine art was produced by the Neanderthals. Notice this paper: evidence for Neanderthal jewelry. Modified white-tailed eagle claws at Krapina. These remains clearly show that these specific Neanderthals made jewelry well before the appearance of modern humans in Europe, extending ornament production and symbolic activity into the European Mousterian. Interbreeding. This right here, amazing line of evidence. We know that interbreeding with these ancient humans allowed Homo sapiens to acquire genes that improve their chances of survival. And some of these genes remain in many of us today. Some of the DNA inherited from Neanderthals seems to have been involved in boosting immunity. God, the biological definition of species, if you can interbreed, you're the same species. That's why you'll find a lot of evolutionary biologists now saying, well, we just don't like any of the definitions of species. They have to just reject it all, play semantics, because obviously the DNA data puts Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens as the same species. I mean, that's it. You can interbreed, you're the same species. For example, while a gene variant inherited from Denisovans present today in Tibetan populations may enable better survival at high altitudes. Again, we have examples in their genetics, although highly inbred, the end-stage Neanderthal, we do have examples of genes that show that they in many ways were better than us, more superior than us. Notice this. There are modern era people groups such as Aboriginal Tasmanians or nomadic tribes living today in Africa who, until recently, have had a very limited cultural inventory, arguably less advanced than that of Neanderthals. If their limited cultural inventory had been found in the fossil record, evolutionary paleo experts might assume they belong to a subhuman species. So the whole point of this section I have underlined, is paleoanthropologists and proponents of human evolution, they would assume that if there wasn't any cultural inventory or limited cultural inventory found with certain hominids, they would conclude that this wasn't a sophisticated or intelligent people group, right? But obviously that thinking has been overturned with Neanderthals, because we do find significant cultural inventory. You can't write off a people group as being human or sophisticated or intelligent just because they may have limited cultural inventory. Because even today, we have groups of people, or even groups who lived relatively recently that we know are fully human, may not have had an impressive cultural inventory. So that's just a bad argument to look to. Ironically, there's now mounting evidence from archaeology that reveals, here we go, a very impressive Neanderthal cultural inventory. The perceived cultural gap between Neanderthals and modern humans is rapidly closing with every new discovery. Here's some attributes, for example. Complex symbolic communication systems, capacity for innovation, efficient hunting abilities, sophistication in weaponry, highly varied diet, use of traps and snares, large social networks, etc. Okay, there's compelling evidence that Neanderthals were just as capable as anatomically modern humans from the Upper Paleolithic. In fact, Neanderthals appear to showcase some skill sets superior to those of modern humans. And yet there's still some that want to say that what we're looking at in terms of the Neanderthals is nothing more than a unsophisticated animal, different speed, just a beast. How you can say such a thing in light of the data is flabbergasting. In our study, none of the explanations listed in the introduction and in Table 1 proved to be supported by adequate archaeological data. We have found no data in support of the supposed technological, social, and cognitive inferiority of Neanderthals compared to their anatomically modern human contemporaries. Was not different enough to support the purported cognitive gap. There's no gap between them and their contemporary modern humans. The evidence for cognitive inferiority is simply not there. It's not there. It doesn't exist. What we are saying is that the conventional view of Neanderthals is not true. It's time to accept the data for what it is. And one thing I wanted to point out before we move on is when it comes to just humans in the fossil record in general, okay, we actually see, because we've seen a few times here the dates, the assumptions based on the secular time frame. We actually don't see evidence in the fossils of hundreds of thousands to millions of years of human existence. Take the evolutionary time frame, for example, that we've seen. Okay, let's even go to Homo erectus. Neanderthal, same thing. We do have a lot of fossils, but not nearly enough fossils to demonstrate how many should have lived in the course of how long evolutionists would say that they existed. Erectus, for example. Okay, they lived across Eurasia, Africa, and they essentially handled a massive distribution. Now, let's say Homo erectus, let's say their average generation time is roughly 20 years. That means every 20 years, you have another million dead bodies. And so after a million years, we have over 20 billion dead people. Okay, maybe that's an overestimate, but at least in the billions, okay, when it comes to erectus. And yet this is 20 billion people of which we have no evidence ever existed. Even the evolutionists would agree that Homo erectus had technology, although they would probably say primitive technology, but they would have had villages, they would have had fire, campsites, and yet no evidence of supposedly, millions of years of existence and reproduction of Homo erectus. So, that's pretty fascinating. And I bring that up in most of my debates on human evolution. I never get a good response to that. One of the most impressive technologies employed by Neanderthals, and of course, dating back to their secular timelines, is their ability to synthesize pitch from birch bark through the controlled use of fire. Goes to show that they were very capable pyrotechnologists. We're still learning how they did it 250,000 years ago. For sake of time, I won't read all of this. But there are people today, okay, experimental archaeologists that have attempted to produce birch bark pitch without the use of modern technology. And it is showing just what a difficult feat it is. It's a feat of wonder how these Neanderthals were able to perform this task that apparently were, nothing more than beasts to some groups. And the evidence just strongly refutes that. So, okay, let's continue here. Controlled use of fire. Experimental studies show that production, and I told you guys, leaving no stone unturned here. So production of pitch in the absence of airtight pottery containers requires a high degree of technical knowledge. A number of Neanderthal sites have provided evidence for this technology. This is an interesting one here. that a lot of your paleoanthropologists that would be referred to as lumpers would actually lump all the so-called different species of the Homo genera into one species, one group. And the famous pit of bones is an example of this. Found in Spain, show that it is possible for a single population to display features characteristic of all major hominin species in the genus Homo: erectus, heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens, all in the same pit of bones. This proves that all these people coexisted and were part of a diverse interbreeding population. Again, in 2010, the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome confirmed that Neanderthals and Denisovans are members of our own species, Homo sapiens. But again, it's important to notice that there is a ton of inbreeding. Again, we're looking at the end stage Neanderthal when it comes to their genetics, and the inbreeding was population-wide. It is important to note that the Neanderthals have changed much over time. The classic Neanderthals we think of were highly inbred and actually on the verge of extinction. But amazingly, they were well adapted to the environment that they did exist in. Okay, those cold environmental conditions that we discussed earlier. And these post-flood ice age conditions, they would have been harsh. And the early Neanderthals probably would have looked a lot more like modern humans or closer to heidelbergensis. But the point is, when we look at the end stage Neanderthals, we're looking at a subpopulation of humans that are extremely inbred, who have accumulated massive numbers of mutations and are on their way to extinction. And we're going to touch on that a little bit more later. Neanderthal burial sites corroborate what the DNA evidence is now showing. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals lived together in the same communities, intermarried, worked together, and were buried together. Okay, notice this. Okay, a modern day Neanderthal, you could say. The former world champion boxer, okay, Nikolai Veluev, also a member of the Russian parliament, happens to display Neanderthal-like features in the skull. He has a sloping forehead and heavy brow ridges capristic of Neanderthal. His chin is modern, but if his skull cap were found as an isolated bone in the fossil record, as most Neanderthal skull caps are found. Remember, the fossil record is very fragmented. It's very poor, and most of the bones found are in isolation. They're bone fragments. A splitter might misclassify him as a separate species. Notice there. Separate species. There are a number of modern human skulls that fall outside the accepted human range, because a lot of, even some young Earth creationists want to say, based on the morphology, Neanderthals should be a separate species. Young Earth creation is saying this. What we know about environmental adaptation, what we know about morphological degeneration due to inbreeding and accelerated mutation accumulation and therefore genetic degeneration? No, not a different species. There are a number of modern human skulls that fall outside the accepted human range. For instance, there are a number of Australian Aboriginal skulls that do not meet the typical standard of modern human crania, yet no one doubts they are fully human. The skulls displayed a number in these Australian Aboriginal skulls. The skulls displayed a number of morphological similarities to Neanderthals. Nobody would say they're a different species. Decades later, in the Journal of Anatomy, anatomists dubbed an Aboriginal skull Neanderthaloid, which showed so-called primitive features characteristic of Neanderthals, such as an extremely low sloping forehead and a pronounced brow ridge. Are we going to say that that's a different species? No, of course not. Other skulls attributed to Homo sapiens have been found that display Neanderthal features. Guys, this isn't one or two cases, okay? This isn't an anomaly. Some skulls displayed elongated and low-lying vaults, forward projecting faces, pronounced brow ridges, and a reduced chin. Extensive coexistence. One of the clearest evidences that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are one and the same species is their extensive overlap in time and space. Overlap and coexistence is exactly what we would predict as a biblical creationist. And we see overlap and coexistence with all the so-called examples of human evolution in the human genera. Okay, Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores, the Hobbit, for example, which is just another case of isolation-related reductive evolution. Homo luzonensis, Neanderthalensis, of course, erectus, Naledi, the Australopithecines, what we see, Paranthropus. This is what we see as coexistence, which is what we'd expect to find as a biblical creationist. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occupied the same territory of Western Eurasia for at least 60,000 years, according to conventional dating methods, of course. So there clearly would have been commingling of their cultures. The contact between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals is described as extensive and long-lasting. Cartmill and Smith note, such a broad hybrid zone would cast doubt on whether the morphs involved really should be thought of as a separate species. Exactly right. Evolutionary studies have estimated geographic separation between subpopulation must endure for at least 1 million years before speciation can occur. They go on to say it is doubtful that the isolation went on long enough for complete reproductive isolation to occur. Okay, so I want to touch on a few things here, the bigger picture, and we're going to do full presentations on this in the future as well. Human evolution or genetic degeneration. Listen, guys, a lot of times these paleoanthropologists, the field is competitive. They find, a bone found in the dirt that's anomalous, or what they would say is primitive or basal. Okay, when in fact it's actually due to morphological degeneration, founder effects, pathology. And that's the problem, is the conclusions a lot of these paleoanthropologists make on these anomalous bones and features. Okay, it can be deceiving because we know that morphological degeneration or disease and pathology can mimic what they would assume are primitive characteristics, or, basal versus derived. So-called primitive humans are inbred subpopulations. Unfortunately, some of our human diversity arises from pathology. This is true in the present, and this was true in the past. There are aging people, there are people with disease, and there are people born with defects. This is sad but true. Geneticists now know the human race is accumulating harmful mutations at an alarming rate and must presently be degenerating genetically. We've talked a great deal about genetic entropy on this channel. I've had plenty of formal debates on it, and no evolutionist is able to provide a type of selection that can rid the population of so many low impact, nearly neutral, and deleterious mutations that are pouring into the genetics of living organisms generation after generation. Most of these mutations being effectively neutral, which means they're invisible to selection. Selection can't see them. And so populations degenerate over time. We see this with the number of mutation-related diseases that are being manifest, and selection is too limited. Selection involves the death of individuals. Every single human being on the planet today is multiply mutant. Selection can't remove every single human being, or else that would be immediate extinction. Okay, even if you were to remove through selection, okay, 50% of the worst mutants on the planet. 50%. So let's say you remove 4 billion people. You're still left with 4 billion people then that are more mutant than the generation before it. Every single rescue device that the evolutionist has put forth, truncation selection, synergistic epistasis, mutation count mechanism, okay, you name it. Trade-offs when it comes to beneficial mutations and effectively neutral mutations. No, they've all been looked at. They don't work. And selection is limited. Okay, genetic entropy, genetic degeneration it's a reality. Now, notice this, though, as this applies to what we're discussing here. This degenerative process accelerates whenever a small population is reproductively isolated for many generations. This results in inbreeding and accelerated mutation accumulation. Furthermore, when just a few closely related individuals start a new and isolated population, guys, this is where we get the founder effects. You have a few closely related individuals. Let's say you get a few individuals of, let's say, Homo erectus that get onto an island, the island of Flores. After a few generations where this isolated population is obviously inbreeding, if there's only a few of them, and their hidden reservoir of deleterious mutations are manifested, leading to what? Morphological degeneration, founder effects, where we have these anomalous features population wide. Okay, because there's a lot of straw manning going on. Like, what, you're trying to say that every individual within this population had this disease or that disease? No, there's probably a ton of different diseases, mutation related diseases going on. As a result, the population has shrunk in body size, brain size. I'm talking specifically about these island dwellers like the Hobbit, Naledi. Naledi was in an isolated group found in a cave, but Luzonensis, for example. So reductive evolution can happen to the entire population. That's the point. Not just one individual, the entire population, whereby their descendants, notice this, their descendants will manifest the genetic peculiarities and defects of the founding individuals. That means these features that we find are not primitive or basal or transitional or in between, or more Australopithecine-like. No, they are due to founder effects, morphological degeneration, genetic degeneration. They're defects of the founding individuals that are manifested in groups of further generations. Okay, it's that simple. We propose that founder effects, inbreeding, and genetic degeneration gave rise to the anomalous populations we now call Neanderthals, erectus, Hobbit, Naledi, I would say Luzonensis as well, and also some of these ape types would also probably experience genetic degeneration and therefore would manifest some anomalies in their phenotype. But Neanderthals are a different case. And me and Matt are going to touch on this later in the discussion. Neanderthals are a mix. Adaptation to their environment, longevity because they are a branch of early man, and as a result, the end stage Neanderthal, genetic degeneration. Mixture of both. Mixture of all three. Interestingly, paleo experts are now drawing attention to these populations, which are now being described as living in isolation and inbred. Neanderthals lived in the harsh climate of glacial Europe, where only a sparse population would survive by hunting. Naledi lived among the caves of the South African wilderness. Hobbit lived on the remote Indonesian island of Flores, Homo floresiensis. Each of these settings would lead to founder effects, isolation, and inbreeding. These things would lead to genetic pathologies and anomalous skulls. This would lead to many deleterious mutations arising and becoming what? Fixed. So no more straw man. I've even seen, unfortunately, some young earth creationists of differing positions on this. Straw man. We're talking about fixed anomalies, fixed features, the deleterious mutations obviously becoming fixed. But what manifests is oftentimes anomalies in the phenotype, and then those becoming fixed as well. Again, the tiny Homo floresiensis highlights another way in which our ancient relatives adapted to their environment, becoming smaller. Notice this, reductive evolution, becoming smaller, and this is not from a young earth creationist website, in response to the limited resources available in the island environment of Flores, Indonesia. A process known as what? Island dwarfism. Guys, you have a population that's small, there's limited resources, limited food. Well, you know what happens? Selection, okay, will look to the brain. The brain is energetically costly. And therefore, after generation and generation, okay, of these types of environmental stressors, what would happen is the brain would shrink, because a smaller brain means less need for food and resources, because as I pointed out, the brain is energetically costly. Same with the bodies. And eventually you have founder effects and fixation going on, and you have a population of really small individuals. That is not evidence for evolution. It's evidence for reductive evolution, genetic degeneration acting on small populations. Notice this. Evidence showing that the early human population referred to as Neanderthal, and again, if anybody has read Contestant Bode's fantastic book, highly recommend it. If you've read it, leave a good review. The authors of this book worked hard on it and deserve a good review on Amazon if you can. So Neanderthalensis was highly inbred and had a very high genetic load, 40% less fit than modern humans. A bunch of sources there. This severe genetic degeneration probably contributed to the disappearance of that population. There's also evidence that the early human population referred to as Hobbit, right, Homo floresiensis, was also inbred and apparently suffered from a special type of genetic degeneration called reductive evolution, insular dwarfing. Well understood, well known. This results in what? Reduced body size, reduced brain volume, and various pathologies. The critics, the skeptics are arguing against the facts. Homo naledi was likewise inbred and suffered from reductive evolution, again resulting in reduced brain size, body size, and various pathologies. Now, we as a young Earth creationists, to support this position, we can make a prediction based on DNA. If we ever do get accurate DNA from these so-called hominids, then we can predict that we are going to get a reflection of their overall degeneration like we find in Neanderthals. We see in their genetics, they're very homozygous. We see they were 40% less fit. So we can predict that we'd find the same thing if we had the DNA of these human variants as well. Homo erectus were inbred and suffered from reductive evolution. However, it seems the genetic degeneration of erectus was less advanced, generally resulting in more moderate reductions in body size, brain size, and pathologies. Indeed, many paleoanthropologists would fold both Hobbit and Naledi into the more diverse erectus category. And here's just an example how, one disease out of many, we're not saying that, these populations had this one disease, and exhibited this one pathology. And so they all did. No, this is just an example, okay, from the secular literature, how disease, pathology, morphological degeneration can be confused by the evolutionist or the paleoanthropologist as being basal or primitive, when in fact it's not. It's something different. So here's a quote from Oxnard. It's remarkable that so many features similar to those normally present in great apes, in Australopithecus and Paranthropus, and in early Homo, example, erectus, and even to some degree Neanderthalensis, but not in modern Homo sapiens, are generated in humans by growth deficits due to the absence of thyroid hormone. In other words, many of the pathological features of cretinism mimic the primitive characters of evolution. And imagine you have this population that's experiencing overall genetic and morphological degeneration. What would also come with that, naturally, it's a ripple effect, is disease upon disease upon disease, all manifesting themselves in different ways. Okay. Oh, we don't have, inbred humans that look exactly like, let's say, Naledi or these examples of the past. Yeah. And guess what? Different environmental conditions, different forms of reductive evolution, different population sizes, histories, different diseases being manifested outwardly. I mean, these arguments that I'm seeing from the critics are just not good at all. Not good at all. In other words, many of the pathological features of cretinism mimic the primitive characters. Notice this. Of evolution, making it easy to mistake pathological features for primitive characters. The differences can be disentangled by understanding the underlying biology of characters. If a modern human with cretinism can have many pathological features that mimic the so-called primitive features of evolution, it is highly likely that robust humans such as Homo erectus with cretinism will have as many, if not more, of these features. This is a fascinating paper, An Abundance of Developmental Anomalies and Abnormalities in Pleistocene People by Eric Trinkhaus. Where we see inbreeding, we see degeneration. We see disease, pathology. Okay. Notice this. The author examined partial skeletons representing a wide cross-section of the early Homo bones. These bones are clearly human, but are generally considered to be precursors to our own species. The author reports that this limited sample of bones includes 75 documented anomalies or abnormalities from 66 individuals spanning the Pleistocene, but primarily from the late Pleistocene. The author explains that the remarkably high frequency of skeletal pathologies could not possibly be due to chance. Well, when you understand the biblical creation model, where after the flood, and especially after the Tower of Babel event, we have these groups of people, oftentimes going into less than ideal environments and conditions and parts of the earth. They become isolated, inbred. What manifests is morphological degeneration due to genetic degeneration. Reductive evolution manifests. We also have these harsh environmental conditions, and therefore we have environmental degeneration. No, when you understand this from the biblical creation starting point, then this makes sense. But the author here holds to the secular model of deep time evolution and ape to man evolution. Well, then guess what? They're going to have to say that, this is kind of odd. Like this is a lot of abnormalities going on. The author suggests that these populations were almost certainly undergoing genetic degeneration due to inbreeding. Exactly. perfectly expected in our model here, as is expected in any small and isolated human population. This new paper strongly supports a primary thesis of our two books, Contested Bones and Genetic Entropy, two fantastic books I highly recommend. The widely presumed prehumans, such as Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, and Homo naledi, were neither pre-human nor less than human. They were members of our own species who were undergoing accelerated genetic degeneration due to severe and extended inbreeding. Now, we'll oftentimes point out that there's coexistence between the Homo genus and the Australopithecines, right? Or we'll say, well, it looks like, Floresiensis, maybe naledi, maybe luzonensis is a more degenerated form of erectus, who itself is degenerated from a healthy variant of human. Okay, maybe human variant that looks more like modern Homo sapiens, or maybe Heidelbergensis. And they'll say, well, erectus, that's not modern Homo sapiens. But here's the thing: erectus, all the evidence when it comes to Homo erectus suggests that it was a sophisticated, intelligent people group and not a different species. Notice this: the ability of erectus to sail across 10 to 15 mile wide deep water straits against strong ocean currents, which makes sense how erectus could get to these islands and then devolve even more into Homo floresiensis or luzonensis, or in this cave, naledi. While you have some proponents of human evolution, militant proponents that want to say, no, floresiensis is the result of like an Australopithecine-like ancestor. What in the world? How did this Australopithecine ape get to this island? Okay, which speaks of purposeful navigation and therefore of human intelligence. That doesn't make any sense. We actually put out a video a while ago critiquing that explanation and hypothesis, and there's never been a response to it because it's ridiculous. Ridiculous. Likewise, the controlled use of fire, sophisticated language, and paleo art reveal a human mind and soul when it comes to erectus. Moreover, the overall morphology of erectus overlaps extensively with modern humans, as paleoanthropologists freely confess. The erectus postcranial skeleton is indistinguishable from that of modern Homo sapiens, apart from subtle differences detectable only through the eyes of a trained anatomist. Indeed, most of the classic features attributed to erectus, including those found in the skull and face, have been found in modern humans. For all these reasons, evolutionary paleo experts known as lumpers acknowledge that erectus is a variant form of Homo sapiens, and we agree. And we can go on and on over the additional line of evidence that speaks of the humanity of erectus: language, speech, communication, reasoning, foresight, planning, ingenuity, bead and pendant manufacturers / necklaces, controlled use of fire, butchering, skinning, and transporting large game animals, watercraft assembly and sailing against an ocean current, which speaks of purposeful navigation, therefore sophistication and intelligence. There can be no doubt that erectus exhibited an array of sophisticated abilities requiring fully human cognition. Artifacts found in association with erectus clearly speak of mental capacity that overlaps with that of modern human. Briefly, we can cover island isolation in these people groups like Floresiensis and Luzonensis. Notice this: from a non-young Earth creationist source, others such as me wonder whether the Luzon finds might eventually turn out to be a variant of the already known Homo floresiensis. We know that island isolation can be a catalyst. Notice this: a catalyst, exactly what we're saying in our model, for some odd evolutionary changes. Odd evolutionary changes. Isn't that funny? So you have these odd, quote unquote, evolutionary changes where you have these anomalous features now that paleoanthropologists pick up, hold up, and say, look, we're dealing with something that's primitive, or they'll say it's basal as compared to derived or transitional, when in fact, no, it is an odd morphological adaptation, I guess you could say, as a result of reductive evolution that is not evidence for ape to man evolution. It's evidence for reductive evolution, island isolation, including reversions to an apparently primitive state. See, apparently primitive states. So the devolution on these subpopulations that are isolated manifest themselves in apparent primitive states, not actually primitive, not actually pre-human, but devolution, and therefore exhibiting or manifesting themselves of that which is primitive. Some will argue that the primitive features of Homo luzonensis are evidence of a pre-Homo erectus dispersal out of Africa, perhaps more than 2 million years ago, says Chris. H. floresiensis and Homo luzonensis would represent some of the last survivors of that primitive early wave lingering on at the fringes of the inhabited world. Notice this: others would prefer to regard these island forms as descendants of Homo erectus, subject to isolation and island dwarfing over a considerable period of time. We agree. We agree. Remember, you can find this in the paleoanthropological literature itself. Okay, this is important as we start to wind down here, guys. This is a lot, I know. I have a feeling it's also been way more than an hour, but there's so much here. Our model begins with a very small anatomically modern human population in the general region of the Middle East, which includes Northeast Africa. This human population undergoes rapid population growth and subsequent dispersion of tribes in all directions into Africa, Europe, and Asia, and eventually into the Americas. Fragmentation of the original population leads to many isolated tribes. This is what we've been talking about this whole time. These isolated tribes, you'd have isolated tribes of erectus, isolated tribes of Neanderthals, island isolation examples like luzonensis and floresiensis, isolation in Naledi. Okay, none of these examples of human evolution, but evidence of reductive evolution, resulting in both genetic and linguistic founder effects. Phenotypic differences between tribes, notice this, phenotypic differences between tribes become exaggerated due to assortative mating. The rapidly diverging tribes are driven apart due to competition for resources, as well as growing linguistic, cultural, and phenotypic differences. This would lead to rapid global dispersion and regional differences in certain skull features, as is consistent with what multi-regionalists see in the fossil record. Degenerated populations due to isolation and other negative effects. How do outlying populations such as erectus, Neanderthal, and Hobbit fit into our model? Throughout this book, we have pointed out that small isolated populations are subject to accelerated genetic degeneration. Very early in human history, these anomalous populations split off from anatomically modern human populations, become isolated, and then experience inbreeding, genetic drift, and eventual mutational meltdown. The decline of such populations could happen quite rapidly, resulting in bone beds that show various degrees of genetic degeneration. This would explain the variable degrees of pathology, dwarfing, distorted skulls, and reduced brain volume seen in erectus, Hobbit, and Naledi. So lastly, the better model, guys. The major difference in our model is that we propose the reverse. Rather than erectus, because remember, the evolutionists, they believe you have the Australopithecines evolving, and then eventually you have Homo habilis, some dead ends and side branches like Sediba possibly, and then eventually Homo erectus and then Homo sapiens. But they'll look to two out of Africa events where you have Homo erectus leaving Africa. And then from there, you would get Heidelbergensis, you might get Neanderthals, you could get the islanders, I guess you could say, where it's floresiensis and luzonensis, you can get Naledi. But in Africa, you eventually get modern Homo sapiens, and the modern Homo sapiens spreads out into all parts of the globe. And then, wow, look at this. We have these different people groups that we didn't know existed, and we can interbreed with them. Okay. As compared to the biblical creation model, would say rather than erectus regionally evolving into modern humans evolved locally into erectus, Hobbit, and Naledi. This is what the evidence best suggests, guys, as we've been touching on. Those early inbred colonies were later replaced as larger, more viable populations filled the world. The early isolated and inbred colonies would leave behind the earliest bones and would soon disappear. Now, why are Neanderthals so different from modern humans? So there's a number of reasons then. Environmental adaptation, right? Due to different environmental pressures. They would have also been an early branch of man. So they would have started off with a different set of biodiversity right off the bat. They're early branch of man. There's also been a lot of genes lost over time, including these longevity genes, because we know Neanderthals were actually better than us in a whole lot of ways. But early man, right after the flood, would have been more diverse than today. A lot more diverse, especially if it's a group that is yet to become isolated and inbred, they'd have more levels of heterozygosity. Heterozygosity means a state of DNA diversity. Homozygosity, a state of no DNA diversity. Over time, you go from shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity, where eventually you can reach a wall where you've lost a lot of that diversity, especially if it's a small population that's branched off and has become isolated and therefore inbred. Okay. We also see that the empirical evidence suggests that Neanderthals picked up a ton of mutations over time, based on the environmental conditions that they lived in. They'd be lacking a lot of vitamins, especially vitamin D. They lived in this dark world, essentially, right, where we'd get degeneration there. The inbreeding would reveal the hidden reservoir of deleterious mutations. They'd come to the forefront, leading to rapid genetic degeneration, especially if you have a lot of these longevity or healthy genes that are now subject to a world that they're not used to. You'd have rapid decline. It would be like somebody who's extremely healthy and body-wise and blood-wise alkaline, like Matt here, who just decided to have McDonald's breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the next 6 months. He's going to decline more rapidly than somebody who's been eating McDonald's their entire lives. Okay, they would be more so used to it. They could have been probably, and this is something Matt's going to touch on, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly. Neanderthals essentially could have been founded by an early biblical patriarch in his old age. There's something called patriarchal drive. And because man would have lived a lot longer in the pre-flood world and then in the immediate post-flood world, okay, that would mean Neanderthals, if they were founded by somebody in their old age, they'd have more mutations to pass on. And so Neanderthals would have started off with a whole gigantic number of new mutations. So on a phylogenetic tree, you may have long branches, which don't essentially mean long time frames. It just means a lot of mutations that have been picked up over time, which means we'd have Neanderthals who are a group that start off with a different set of biodiversity because they're closer to early man, they're closer to the flood. And then also due to patriarchal drive, they add new mutations, more differences in their biodiversity. And patriarchal drive is an important topic. We're going to leave that to Matt for now. And yeah, we'll save it at that. For patriarchal drive, we'll get more into that later. But here's a problem that I want to address as we really wind down here with the evolutionary view of Neanderthal. Okay, notice this. According to the evolutionary timeline, Neanderthal split away from the main human population about 400,000 years ago, but was somehow not part of the African near extinction event. Neanderthal then reunited with the emerging human population, which was only recently coming out of Africa. So we have Homo sapiens that go through a radical genetic reshaping, these massive changes in Africa. And then Neanderthal is going through their own genetic reshaping and their own changes outside of Africa. But yet Homo sapiens remain interfertile with Neanderthal. How's that? That wouldn't make any sense given the deep time evolutionary time frame. But if they're only separated by a shorter amount of time, like in the biblical creation model, then that makes sense. In our model, the early post-flood human population of about 1,000 to 10,000 people was split apart at Babel. This is an article here from Dr. Robert Carter, who we've had on before to discuss Neanderthals, actually. He's got a lot of fascinating information on this topic. Different groups went different directions on the globe, and each saw different environmental pressures, experienced different demographic pressures, and were subject to different mutational events. Simple, right? Neanderthals are one of those groups. They are different because they had a different history. It's that simple. You don't got to be a geneticist. You don't got to be a genius to understand that when the evolutionist says, well, the Neanderthals are different, how do you explain that? Well, they had different environmental pressures, different demographic pressures, different mutational events, different environments, different histories. Okay, so where they want to try and trap you, no, it's not going to work. But small populations are also at risk due to the high rate of mutation accumulation, which eventually leads to extinction due to error catastrophe. The accumulation of non-synonymous mutations in important genes is evidence for a high mutation rate acting on a small population under threat of extinction. It could also indicate the presence of post-mortem DNA degeneration that their techniques could not discern. If the results are valid, the accumulation of deleterious mutations might help to explain the disappearance of the Neanderthals. Notice this, genetic drift is very important, guys. And also, fixation means to just get stuck in place, to be fixed, to be stuck in place. When you have a small population and you have a lot of mutations, deleterious mutations that are coming to the forefront due to inbreeding, and also maybe you've got mutations in important DNA repair enzymes. So now you got more mutations being passed on from generation to generation, and therefore becoming fixed. Rapid fixation, which means we have a lot of new mutations that are being fixated in the population, and therefore genetic markers in Neanderthals that would not be found in humans today, or genetic markers in humans today that would not be found in Neanderthals. Okay, so not a problem for the biblical creation model. According to standard population genetics theory, the likelihood of any new mutation displacing all other alleles within the population is directly proportional to the size of the population. That is, in a population of 1,000 individuals, a new mutation has a chance of 1 in 1,000 of becoming fixed. Remember, to be stuck in place. If the 1,000 individuals, or if the Neanderthal population was small or was restricted, which we know they were, to a small size for a number of generations, genetic drift could have occurred what? Rapidly. Is it any surprise that Neanderthals do have some specific genetic markers and some differences in their genetics when we quantify and qualify them than modern Homo sapiens? Say, no, of course not. This makes sense. Small populations are also at greater risk of extinction due to the high rate of mutation accumulation, which eventually leads to extinction due to error catastrophe. This Neanderthal sequence has many deleterious mutations, several of those in one particular gene. Why is this so? Should not natural selection have weeded out these negative mutations? Instead, they accumulated. The authors of the paper said that purifying selection had broken down. Purifying selection had broken down. Now selection is not acting upon these deleterious mutations. They're being passed on. They're not being rid of. And therefore, they're not being selected for. They're going to become fixed. A lot of them are going to become fixed, or a lot of them are just going to lead to genetic degeneration and just more differences in their genetics. This is evidence for a high mutation rate acting on a small population. Poor nutrition has been linked. Genetic damage has been linked to poor nutrition. According to the theory, when under starvation conditions, which we know would have been the case for a lot of these so-called hominid people groups, the body has to decide which systems to keep working and which to shut down. Remember, selection acts in the short term, not the long term. It's not worried about getting cancer 50 years from now, or it's not worried about the state of, let's say, the Neanderthal population, 1,000 years down the road. No, how do we deal with what's going on now? And that's where we see things being shut down. This is where reductive evolution comes into play. Okay, which systems is selection going to keep working? Which ones is selection going to shut down? This genetic triage mechanism would keep an organism alive, but at the expense of less than critical cellular operations like DNA repair. Let's get rid of the DNA repair enzymes, shut them down. At least we're surviving till tomorrow. And we see this in the Lenski experiment. Bacteria are subject to reductive evolution. They lose genes short term, but it's long term degeneration. It's kind of like your car. Let's say you wanted to get better gas mileage for the time being. So what do? You remove weight. Okay. Gas prices are crazy today. Go remove some weight, remove your doors, remove the steering wheel, remove some stuff in the car, the side mirrors. Okay. You're going to get better gas mileage temporarily, but overall you're removing stuff from the car. It's worse for the car. It's reductive. And that's what we see in terms of reductive evolution in living organisms. The bacteria in Lenski's experiment have shrank in functional genome size, because you can only remove genes for so long before your entire genome shrinks, and you lose many important genes along with it. It has been suggested by several creationists that the Neanderthal population lived in Europe under less than ideal conditions. We talked about this, and was subjected to nutrient limitations. Notice everything we're seeing here. You see how I set this up? The first 45 minutes or so, where we went through a lot of secular papers and articles, non-young earth creationist sources, where they have pointed all of these things out as well. Their environment, their conditions, the way they looked, the way they were, the way they acted. Okay, as creationists, we're not just making this stuff up. Specifically, vitamin D deficiency due to the perpetually cloudy weather during the post-flood ice age. Couple a harsh environment and a poor nutrition to a small inbreeding population, you have an instant recipe for the rapid accumulation of mutations. It is entirely possible that Neanderthals accumulated mutations very rapidly in the years after the flood. This is now what we know based on new incoming data. Based on this single sample, Neanderthals have many mutations not seen in any modern human. Even so, this Neanderthal sequence is closer to modern humans than many living chimps are to one another. Guys, Neanderthals are still 99.7% similar to us. Remember, every single human today is 99.999% similar, which makes sense. From the biblical creation starting point, God creates Adam and Eve, two people. This restricts genetic diversity. And so we would predict low genetic diversity. That's what we find. Perfectly in line with the biblical creation model. The evolutionists, on the other hand, they would predict high levels of genetic diversity if we've been evolving for millions of years. And yet, what do we find? Low levels of genetic diversity. So the evolutionists, they did not predict this. And so they invented the out of Africa population bottleneck. Post hoc, ad hoc. That's all it is. But Neanderthal is 99.7% similar to us. Very, very similar. So here's the last two slides we're going to do. And there's been a lot of information. I understand, guys. I'm definitely looking forward to a break here. So let's leave no stone unturned and then hand it over to Matt. In the end, we expect a chaotic early history of man. That is, even if the events are fixed in history, it will be very difficult to predict the exact pattern that should result from the starting conditions. The combination of rapid early population growth, patriarchal drive, fragmentation of the population after Babel, with the subsequent long-term isolation of some groups and extreme inbreeding in some, population surges and collapses, and selective sweeps, either naturally or through war and conquest, creates a recipe for exactly the type of tree when it comes to phylogenetics, especially because the evolutionists will try, like the more militant evolutionists, they'll try to say based on cladogenesis that Neanderthals are a sister species. They belong to a different clade. Nope. That shows a lack of understanding in terms of the details of the Neanderthals, their genetics, the way they live, their environments. No. Notice this. Exactly. This is a recipe for exactly the type of tree that we see. And that's it. So I appreciate you guys sticking with me for the entire presentation. Very detailed. Hour and 45 minutes. I was curious to see how much time we went. And Matt, good to see that you're still here, brother. Matt, I started the presentation and it was beautiful where you were. Sun was shining, birds were chirping, and now look at you.
Yep. It's still warm though, so I'll take it.
So over to you, brother. Thoughts, and I know you got some stuff to say as well. And I'm going to sit back and relax. Wow, that was lots of fun. And I guess the fun continues. So over to you, Matt.
Yeah, you covered a lot. I even had to take notes. I was like, wow, you're covering a lot. So I guess the main thing you're saying is, I guess we shouldn't identify as Neanderthal or cavemen, right?
Right.
They're us. We can't identify as ourselves. All right.
No.
Well, here's a good question. Who would have more genetic diversity, a wolf or a chihuahua? Well, going back to the bottleneck, the wolf would, right? Because it could produce all the dog species that we have. So we see genetic diversity declining over the time. And that's where we're going to go with all of this. But before I do, he brought up a lot of the different things that Neanderthal had created. And one of the newest ones that came out this week is that they discovered a cave in Tibet that had prints that were art made by children that were hand and feet. And the feet and hands were exactly like ours, but they were dated at 200,000 years ago. Now, that's the time that that they believe out of Africa was taking place, that the origin of mankind, right, coming out of the bottleneck. Humans didn't exist before that in their model. So what are handprints and feet prints doing in Tibet? Over there, really, really far away. So there's a huge discrepancy that they have to deal with now in this. The rescue devices are coming, so stay tuned for that. And one thing you didn't really touch too much on, we can get into it in a little bit, but would be the Y chromosome data. they've sequenced the high quality, well, they found Y chromosome DNA material in a Neanderthal, and it had never been sequenced before because all we had to go by was mitochondria. And as you guys know, mitochondria is not very large in size. So when it's fragmented mitochondria, it's even smaller, meaning that the mitochondria itself is 16,569 base pairs. And when it's broken, or let's say half of that exists, well, you don't have very much. But the Y chromosome is 60 million base pairs. So having any sequence of that is going to be massive. And that's what we found. And the Neanderthal Y chromosome, and even where the mutations are, were just like ours. So there is no real dispute now genetically. Now, what they do is they try to say they're subhuman. But think about that for a minute. That doesn't mean they're a different species. The definition of a subhuman is less than human as of morality or intelligence associated with human beings today. So think about that. Morality, like we know the morality of a person, of a Neanderthal. Interesting, right? So, and intelligence. So, also something else. So we say they are less intelligent, and their skull case and brain was larger. So why would we say that about them? It's not like they had the ability to make cell phones, right? So we're talking about a population of people that was very small, migrating around in an ice age, and they were surviving. Pretty incredible, right? And the occipital bone in the back part of the brain is actually associated with vision. That's why, because if you think about it, what would natural selection do if you lived in a place where there'd be a snowstorm? Well, you would have to look around. You'd have to be able to see. You can't have zero visibility when there's dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, woolly rhinoceros walking around. You got to be able to see. So they had much better vision. And now we know, because we have some of their art, that they were able to carve things that we cannot see with our eyes today. So they did have better vision, and we know that now. But here's the one interesting thing I also find is very unique, if you guys have your Bibles out, is that Neanderthal is actually mentioned in Scripture. So that's fascinating. And it's mentioned in one of the oldest scriptures that we have that is post-flood, and that's the book of Job. We read in Job 30, verse 1 through 8, about a group of vile people that were driven away from society, and they lived among the bushes. And for survival, they chose to live on cliffs, in valleys, and in caves between the rocks. That's the exact description of what Neanderthal is like. So these were people that were outcast. That's why they didn't come back into society, and why they went north. Because think about it, every other people group population getting off the ark, where they lived there for a while, and then they migrated together to the Middle East area, where they built the Tower of Babel. So far, they hadn't dispersed yet. Then after that, they went where? Where's the best place to go from there? Well, it would be in Africa. That's why it was inhabited first. Therefore, people look the oldest there, because it was the first inhabited place that you would get a group of people migrating to. So it only makes sense. Then after that, you have people going the other direction, which brought them over into India, and eventually into the Australia, while the land bridge was still there, and we have the Aboriginals. So everything kind of shows that exactly that thing played out. So our model says that these people went north, and this is exactly what our model tries to explain these people as having pathologies of people that lived in the cold, and that is what we see. So Neanderthals can't be a different species, because, as Donnie said earlier, the definition of a species is, can we breed with them? And yes, we can. We know that. We also know that we've found a Neanderthal and Denisovan mated and produced a girl that actually had 50-50 genetics of each one. So this also incorporates Denisovan as being humans as well, because, as you guys know, we've only found very little bits of Denisovan, and we don't have that much to go by. So now we know the answer to them as well. So that's also huge news. Also, when we go back in time, we go to Egypt. What do we find in Egypt? when we look at mummies and we unbury the dead and we look at them, we find a huge diversity of skulls. Matter of fact, one of the kings that reigned was like 6'3" and had a huge, massive skull. Then we have little tiny people with massive elongated skulls. We have a lot of diversity going back in time, and we have less diversity now. Well, since humans cannot speciate, that limits our ability to have a lot more variation like the animals do. For example, you look at deer, a lot of variation, fast generation times, lots of species. They're on every continent almost. So you're going to get a lot more variation like that. Human beings were limited because of that limited ability to speciate. So those were just my thoughts initially. Let me regain. I guess if I could explain why humans can't speciate would be using evolution to explain why they can't speciate. For example, you would have to get an isolated group of people for a very long time. Well, if we look at the Australian Aboriginals, they're a perfect example of that. If you want to believe the evolution theory, which says that they lived on this island for 31,000 years. Well, that's population isolation. So when other people eventually came and found them, how come we were still able to breed with them? No problems, no genetic problems whatsoever. It's because they're not a different species. That would be plenty time for species to do it. Because when we look at how many generations it takes to make a new species, look at birds. 2 generations, there's a new species. So clearly 1,200 generations, there's plenty of time for humans to have evolve a new species of humans. And we just don't see that. So here we go. Let's go into this. Right now, my goal would be to replace the out of Africa origin ancestry, or also known as the out of Africa theory, and refute the human chimp split and even more. So let's jump into that. Unless, Donnie, you have anything you want to add, I will get into, I guess, some of my presentation now.
You're good, brother. Go ahead. Floor is yours.
All right. The reason we have paternity tests and they can only show relation between people by basically genomic comparison, and it can only go back about 5 to 7 generations, is that we are passing on this genetic information onto our offspring. And we can take this back, and we never cross a border into another animal doing these paternity tests. Could you imagine if you spit into a cup and sent it to 23andMe and their response was, oh, you're related to a chimp? Good job. You know, amazing, weird. But no, that never happens. And you can't do that with any paternity test with animals of the same related family. And this is what we are talking about now, is genetic boundaries, okay? We're going to get into that. So this has always been confusing for people because I've always tried to explain it using math. So this time we're only going to be doing a few things that have to cover numbers, but not a lot of it. Most of it's going to be explained through a story, allegory, explanations, anything I can do to try to help convey why genetic boundaries exist, how we discovered them, and why we know we can never, ever prove a common ancestor going back in time using genetic boundaries. All right. So the first thing you guys need to understand and know about are mutation rates. They can only take us back to the last bottleneck. That's it, no further. Therefore, anybody ever trying to connect a common ancestor primate to a human, it could never be done. Unless that happened after the last bottleneck. Since even in their theory, that did not happen. It happened 7 million years ago. They will never be able to prove it. All we see are humans going into the last bottleneck and then coming out the other side. Evolution can try and say that primitive man went in and modern day man came out, but this is illogical and nonsensical and basically stupid. So no more further discussion on that. We rewind to Neanderthal and we look at mutations though and humans, and they look the same going into this bottleneck. So now if we rewind chimpanzee species, do they look like humans when we get to that bottleneck? No, they don't. That's independent lines of ancestry, isn't it? That's exactly what we would expect to see if creation was true. So there would be no possible way for them to ever say that they converged in the past and give you evidence of that, because a bottleneck erases diversity. That's how we know what's going on. That's how we know mutation rates go back to a certain bottleneck in time. And that's what the 2018 Rockefeller University study concluded. They said, wow, 90% of all life died and 10% of it went into a bottleneck and came out the other side. What model has ever said that? Only ours. Only ours. That's the Noah's flood. It's exactly what he said. Exactly happened. What do we find when we look in the mitochondria of animals? Take a species of chimpanzee, for example. You look at that mitochondria, what do you find? Well, you find mutations. And you find mutations range around 65 to 75. Well, guess what? That's good. That's a number we can look at and go, can we trace these backwards in time? And we can. We can look in other chimp species and we find these same mutations. We go, okay, so enough time has passed that those have accumulated. So now we know we can either go by evolution assumption that this was 200,000 years, or we can just go by the young Earth creation of about 4,500 years. It doesn't really matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because no matter what you want to do, you can trace those mutations back to that point where there was a bottleneck and easily conclude that all of those 65 to 70 mutations arose in that time. Now, those mutations that I'm talking about are in the CO1 gene, which is a single gene found in the mitochondria. And I like that one because it's highly conserved. So mutations there should be rare. But here we have a bunch of them, right? And it's only 650 base pairs long. And here we have 65 to 70 mutations in a chimpanzee. Now, how does this refute evolution? Very easily, okay? Now, all we have to do is say, well, if 200,000 years passed and we have 65 mutations on average separating chimpanzees, we can cut it down. If you guys want to do the math and make it even easier on yourself, you can say 50. Well, now you can multiply that and say, okay, how many generations do we go back? We would have to multiply that times 35 because we have about 1,000, I would say. It depends on what we're going by. I should be more clear when I'm doing the math, since you guys don't have like a notepad or anything. Let's take the entire mitochondria from the CO1 gene. There's about 1,000 differences in chimpanzees right now. So we're using round numbers. This is much easier, okay? So we go back 200,000 years and 1,000 mutations now came up. So how many times till we get to 7 million years? That's 35 times. So now you multiply 1,000 times 35, and that's how many differences should be in the mitochondria if we look inside of it. That would be 35,000 mutations. Now, obviously, the mitochondria can't get that much. It's only 16,569 base pairs, right? So therefore, how many should we see in there? It's a mutational saturation point of 12,000. How come we don't see mutational saturation? And how come we only find 1,000 mutations? It's because not a lot of time has passed. That's why. And there is no convergence point because it cannot be true. We don't see it. We don't look in the genetics and we don't see it. So therefore, we're limited to what we can see and what we can predict and what we know. And we know that there was a bottleneck. We know independent lines came out. We know mutations have been accumulating, and we know not many have accumulated, and we know the mutation rate is fast. So how can all of those things be possible and evolution be possible? It's not. That's why. So that's a really good way to case close evolution if you want, by using the numbers based on the mitochondria itself. Now that was looking at the entire mitochondria. Like I said, I like using the CO1 gene. So if you guys want to go over the math on that one, it's a little harder because, I should say that was just looking at chimpanzee, by the way. The separation between humans, because humans have also been accumulating mutations, would have caused more of a divergence between us even more. But just looking at chimps, that would have divided us that much because I only looked at their line. So I gave evolution the benefit of the doubt going back in time. And there's not enough. It's just absolutely ridiculous. The differences should be so big that we should be like Eric Poplar, who predicted that if evolution was true, we wouldn't find any genetic similarity because it would be scrambled beyond recognition. And he was right. But because evolution is not true, the genetic similarity that we have comes from creation, and the genetic differences that were already built in are functional differences. Then we get into the bottleneck, and more genetic diversities start increasing because of mutations. But how could genetic diversity increase if it was already full of mutations to begin with? It couldn't increase. There would be no more genetic diversity. So right now do we have more genetic diversity? Well, we look in humans, we look in chimps, and we go, oh, look, genetic diversity is increasing. Well, with a fast mutation rate, we should be at a saturation point anytime, but we don't see that. We keep seeing an increase. And guess what? With only 1,000 mutations total in chimpanzees right now, just above that, actually, it's still got another 11,000 to go before it's saturated. So absolutely incredible. Anyway, I just went on kind of a tangent. I have notes here. I don't know why I don't follow them. So what we see in mutation accumulation going backwards, converging on a single mitochondrial ancestor of all chimpanzees, coming out of a bottleneck and then diverging into all of the different chimp species we see today. There's no convergence with human or even other ape kinds, which is the phylogenetic what it shows, right? Nothing. We see that gorillas, Pongo, chimpanzees, and humans all went into a bottleneck and all came out. That's not convergence, people. So the mutation rates that we see when we look in Pongo and they have more than the gorilla, and then the gorilla has more than chimps, and then the chimps, have more than humans, and then we build that phylogenetic chart, that's made up. That's made up based on the mutations that we're seeing. But since mutations are erased from anything that goes into a bottleneck, and we only see mutations that come into the population after the bottleneck, every phylogenetic chart that's made from mutations is wrong, because we can only go to the bottleneck. See how this refutes it? So let me explain how diversity, actually, let me close this with what I would want before we move on, which is we know Denisovan, Neanderthal, modern day man all met one another and interacted. There's no question about that anymore. Therefore, that immediately rules out them interacting with us before the bottleneck, if you want to go by evolution theory, right? Why? Because humans, modern day man, didn't live back then. How could we have interacted with them? So it only makes sense that we could interact with them when we're alive, right? So that would be after the bottleneck. So therefore, we have the smoking gun refuting evolution, and that it is all these people were living together and at the same time, and that mutation rates, show that there is no possible way we could have lived before the bottleneck. We were all on this side of it together, and mutation rates all take us and funnel us back to the point where we interact with basically Noah and his sons and daughters getting right off the ark. And now we know that the high mutation rate of mutation accumulations that we see in them and all people today all had to take place after the bottleneck. And it fits perfectly with what we've been saying all along, based on what we know about isolation, divergence, and population size. So when we see Neanderthal and we go, oh, look, they have a lot of mutations, they must be older. Well, they can't go past the bottleneck if they have the same mutations that are accumulating after the bottleneck for us to even count these mutations. Because remember, bottlenecks reset genetic diversity. So, matter of fact, if you want to share my screen, share my screen. Why not?
Yeah, definitely, brother. Great stuff so far. As you're doing that, to the audience, thank you for the super chats. Mitchell, Michael, and George Bond. George Bond. Anybody just getting here? We're now going. We've been going for about 2 hours and nonstop on Neanderthals. Lots of information. So if you are just getting here, make sure when our show is done tonight that you go back and check out the first couple hours, because Matt and myself, our goal for tonight is to provide the most comprehensive presentation possible on Neanderthals. So that's what we're doing here. Are you screen sharing, brother?
I think so. No, I don't see it, but
I don't see it at the bottom here for me.
This happened last time.
Did you click let me see, when you click the box, like the middle entire screen? I know you know how to share a screen, so maybe.
Let me try this one. Now that's Chrome has lost permission. Okay, we're not sharing screen.
Sorry to tease you guys.
Yeah, my bad. I'm good. I was planning on showing the pathologies of Neanderthal, what makes them different. You know, the chin that recedes, why that happens. The
I can put that up on screen if you want. I think I've got, from my presentation, I think I have some stuff on that if you want.
Maybe. Sure. I
If you want
created one from the dentist that shows that
to.
the
Oh,
Australian Aboriginals actually have the same jaw from inbreeding.
okay. I might not have that then. I've got that like these, but
Yeah, I gotta send you those.
no worries, brother. No worries.
All right. Well, I mean, I just wanted to close, I guess, with saying that everything that evolution has ever predicted about Neanderthals has been completely wrong. They started out showing a brutish, bent over ape man covered in hair, holding a club, unable to speak, falsified. Then they had to show him standing a little bit more upright, but again, messed up. Able to articulate, but it still looked like a primate, right? But walking, showing feet like a human being, right? And then pretty soon lost the body hair, but still like an idiot, right? Kind of like a hair on the shoulders and like really long, kind of like an ape would be. And then pretty soon we get into just what he showed earlier, a modern looking human being. They have red hair. They found that they had freckles. All the genetics show that what they probably looked like as far as, you know, the soft material, because we don't find that in the fossil records. So how are we going to know that they were basically a ginger? Well, genetics tells us, right? We would see if they had dominant or recessive genes. They would see what happened if they were in a small population that didn't breed with other people, how long they would last in the small population. And evolution was wrong every single time. So with this track record of being wrong, but yet they post it as fact and evidence, it deceives entire generations. And they're going to constantly be throwing nonsense at you all the time. And it's always going to be wrong because that's their track record, right? So if anybody that has a 100% failure track record with nothing but falsifications, it's a pretty bad theory. Now, they've tried. That was good of them to make those predictions and do that, but it's over. Evolution lost a long time ago. They've embarrassed themselves time and time again. Now, the thing is Charles Lyell was a professional liar. He was a lawyer. And what he did is he said, I need to attack geology. And at the time, geology was basically belonged to the creationists. We knew that there was a global flood, and everyone agreed. They can, you know, we see the mix and the problems with the fossil record. We just go, yeah, that's going to happen in a flood, right? Things get mixed up. Then he came along and he said to himself, well, what's the best way when you're defending somebody that's guilty to make them look innocent? Well, don't talk about them at all. Talk about everything else other than that. And that's what Charles Lyell did. He brought his professional lying skills from that directly into the ability to say, I'm going to refute this. And it wasn't until he died, actually, that they went through his journals and discovered that he actually did it for a reason and a purpose. It was to rid the sciences of Moses. He hated scripture, he hated the Bible, and he hated everything that went with it. So his goal was to just create the geologic column, which he did. He invented it. And then he said, we need to get man to believe they're related to the orangutan. And so that was it. And then Charles Darwin took his book, went on his voyage, and said he absolutely loves this, and dedicated his time to trying to prove that that was true. And today we now have the geologic column and evolutionism. And all because of, you can thank Charles Lyell and his ability to pull his lawyering skills onto the general public and con everybody there is. So that's it, man. Your turn. Over to you.
Great stuff. I appreciate it. My voice is almost gone, actually, believe it or not. So again, guys, you know, we've been 2 hours and 10 minutes, and our goal was to give you, you know, 2+ hours worth of information on Neanderthals. Matt, there are a couple questions here, and then there are a couple comments I want to make. Great points, by the way. Redefine living. The chat's lively, moving quick, so I lost the question. I can't put it up on screen, but I remember most of what he was asking. So Redefine Living was asking about orphan genes and their significance when it comes to human and chimpanzee genetic similarity.
Yeah, orphan genes are unique because they're taxonomically restrictive. So we find these genes that belong to different animal families, and they're not found outside the families. So when evolution, again, never predicted these things. And when we found them, we were like, wow, look at how many more humans have than chimpanzees. And chimpanzees also have their own group. But the unique thing isn't that these orphan genes are just different and they look different. but they actually have different functions entirely. Most of the orphan genes in human beings are actually found in our brain, as where orphan genes in chimpanzees are actually found more in their gut and skin. So very, very different on what they're supposed to do at their functional level. And they have to believe that they arose de novoli, meaning they arose out of nowhere. So they're not really sure about these genes. They didn't predict the genes. And then we find these genes that are very unique and subset to different groups of organisms. And they have unique functioning powers that are very strange, because take those away and now you have a huge problem, because orphan genes are also concentrated in the testes, meaning if you remove these, the very unique capabilities that they pass on to our next generation wouldn't even be there to pass on. They're like endogenous retroviruses, right? You can't even have reproduction without them. So how do you have reproduction, right? How do you have the next generation without them? You just don't.
Right. That's a great response. And I'll share screen here as well on orphan genes, because I find it so funny, Matt. And, to get your thoughts on it as well, is we have no examples, right? Orphan genes, no examples of, the precursors. Apparently, they kind of just show up. It's like you have 3 books, but in each of the books, right, written by different authors, let's say, or the same author writing 3 different books. So the books didn't share some type of relationship in terms of the books themselves, but in each book you have very you have words that aren't found in all 3 books, specific words to book A, B, C. And that's what we find with these orphan genes, is we have these taxonomically restricted and essential genes in different creatures that the evolutionists have no way to explain. And it's funny because the rescue devices, again, assume evolution to prove evolution, like de novo gene synthesis, right? Nothing but circular reasoning. Well, why de novo gene synthesis, evolutionists? Well, because of orphan genes. Well, why do orphan genes exist? Well, because of de novo gene synthesis, right? Because they could never consider design diversity, that these may have been front loaded. They're essential. They're integrated into the information systems of living organisms. So these mechanisms for the emergence of new genes have all been looked at, and they fail. They don't work. And a lot of it is just looking at genetic similarities and then inferring that, maybe these are the precursors to the gene itself. And gene duplication, I oftentimes talk about gene duplication followed by neo-functionalization, right? The duplicated gene, you get hopefully beneficial mutations and, a new gene through it. Exon shuffling, retroposition, mobile element activity. This is the big one, de novo origination, a coding gene derived from non-coding DNA. Note that all these mechanisms are inferred from sequence comparison and have little empirical support. So people like Dodgeball, Dan Stern, Cardinal, they'll put forward all these papers about orphan genes as proof of these new genes popping up. But you read through the papers, you don't see in a lab, you don't see empirical evidence, observational evidence of a new gene popping up from a non-coding region of the genome. No, they're comparing sequences, looking at organisms that they think are closely related, let's say to humans, and then comparing, looking for hopefully that which may be a precursor, that which in the non-coding region may have evolved in the human line. Okay, but they're not actually seeing it. It lacks empirical support. Notice the assumption, normally unstated, is that we know the real family tree or the phylogeny of the life forms and genes under consideration. The reality is that nobody has seen how a gene has come to be, and that there are no labels on any organism or its coding genes telling people its parents. Furthermore, nobody is able to go back in time to investigate the issue. Of course, one can wish and claim that a non-coding DNA segment is on the way to becoming a gene, but such claims do not validate much unless he or she is able to prove that this non-coding DNA segment is not degeneration of a gene that used to be. Remember, it's much easier to destroy a gene, for a gene to become broken down or dysfunctional due to mutations, rather than a mutation to make a gene better, to make a gene. Okay, because what we see is primarily degeneration, reductive evolution, loss of allelic variability over time. In addition, it is more likely that this DNA segment has never been and never will be a gene. It just serves as a regulatory, notice this, or structural sequence. So these papers put forth by people like Dodgeball Dan, where when you read the paper, and you notice that it's nothing more than an inference from sequence comparison, it's not an answer to our question or our challenge in how can you explain the origin of orphan genes, which is exactly what a biblical creationist would expect, given the uniqueness in created kinds. So, I've got a whole presentation on orphan genes. So for sake of time, I won't go over them, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that, brother?
Yeah, I think they're another great piece of evidence for young Earth creation. We're looking for things that separate, independent lines of origin, that lineages that show how different we really are. And the evolutionist doesn't look at differences; they only look for similarities. So it's really nice that we have so many differences that the list is actually longer than the similarities now. So I think that's great.
Yeah, amen. And George Bond, yeah, there's a new paper that came out and a commentary on it by Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins in Institute for Creation Research. So check that out. More and more every day, genetics confirms our model. So here's a question for you, brother, that came in during your presentation. The diffraction of light. How did evolution win so that it was paid by taxpayers to be taught in schools?
Yeah, it initially won by going against intelligent design, saying that they don't have a model. And without any the ability to have a model or any predictions, how are you going to teach it in school? So evolution says we try to answer what you can't, and that's the diversity of life that we see today. And since there's no other model that can do it, intelligent design shouldn't be taught. And so they got rid of it, and now they set up an organization that prevents anything from coming against evolution. So it's protected by law. So that's why it's gone uncontested for so long. That's why they get rid of any refuting theories that might arise, even though there's been a lot. They don't even allow students to look at it. You get the single textbook you need to write your answers out of, or you get a failure. There is no questioning evolution. That's what makes it anti-science.
Amen. Well said. Michael Knighton says, you two have totally destroyed the theory / hypothesis of evolution. Guys, if you haven't yet seen Matt and I, we did a 4-hour show last week right here, debunking Guts It Given on human evolution, educating evolutionists. So, of course, as always, the response has been to dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge all over the place. So definitely check that out. It's getting great feedback if you have not yet seen it. He says, but we are here in chat looking at delusional Evos marching along like the king with no clothes on, but thinking they're a pimp. Yeah, we get a lot of keyboard warriors, especially on Facebook. A lot of keyboard warriors. So that's why we put out a debate challenge where myself, Matt, we've done debates in 2022, Professor David McQueen, Kent, he's done 15 debates already. So point is, we put out an evolution debate challenge. Don't be a keyboard warrior in mama's basement. It's time to graduate. Take the challenge. We're sitting here waiting. So yeah, nothing virtuous about being a keyboard warrior. So here's the next question I have for you, Matt. And then I wanted to share screen on some funny comments that I found pertaining to Dodgeball Dan's arguments on Neanderthals.
Okay.
Can you briefly explain why? And I covered it in my opening a little bit, but I think we have to make it clear that when it comes to Neanderthals, right? When it comes to this hypothesis that after Babel, maybe even a little bit before, we have subpopulations that are splitting off from your main population. Right. And what happens is these subpopulations become isolated, maybe on an island like Floresiensis or Luzonensis, or just maybe in different areas like in Asia or Europe, like with the Neanderthals, they become isolated in these environments that are extremely harsh, right? These ecoglacial environments. Homo erectus tribes, for example. So they become isolated, mutations accumulate due to inbreeding, and these mutations are manifested outwardly, and eventually you get founder effects, morphological degeneration, genetic degeneration. But when it comes to the Neanderthals, Matt, can you explain and make it clear that we're not saying that everything about the Neanderthal can be explained through genetic degeneration? No, Neanderthal is a combination of adaptation, rapid adaptation via environment, longevity, and inbreeding. The late stage Neanderthal, incredibly, like we point out, the runs of homozygosity, just massive runs of homozygosity, identical letters demonstrating they were highly inbred, genetically compromised, and 40% less fit. So can you explain how all of those in combination explain the Neanderthals?
Sure. Okay, let's we don't know exactly when they separated from the people, the typical group of people, but let's say the ark came to rest on a mountainside. Let's say we can see either in Turkey, or we can say the row of mountains above India where Mount Everest is. Now they're going to get off, and we have them splitting and going and being cast away. So they're going to go north. That's the direction that we find them in, where it's very, very cold at the time. So now they've already started stage one in adapting to a new environment. Now, that's what natural selection would do, right? So we have people that are living for a very long time, especially within the first, 7 generations. That's when they were living extremely long. We don't know how quickly these groups of people got kicked out from the rest, but if it was in the first 7, then they were extremely diverse groups of people that could live a very long time. But they would be decaying just like everybody else, but even more so because of their small populations being outcast, right? How many groups of people that are outcast are now going to form up? Well, guess what? They have to now, because the conditions force them to now group together, because it's so bad they're going to die if they don't. So now they've got a band of horrible people that are now migrating around trying to find better places to live. Well, guess what? What do they have to do? Well, we know that their main food source were mammoth. So they had to follow the mammoth as they migrated, while also navigating trying to kill them. So they get a lot, not very much vitamin D. And guess what we know they had? They had blue eyes. But at first they didn't. Denisovan did not. They are more related to the people that are on the East Coast, right? So perhaps they went around that side of the mountain range and then diversified, and then went, this is horrible, let's keep going. And so they kept migrating west, realizing they can't get on the other side of those mountain ranges. So they just kept migrating, following them, or following the mammoth, not really sure. But regardless, they migrated eventually to the north. So they were eating only meat. Well, guess what? There's no vitamin C, so they're getting messed up. They're getting they're only, unless they're eating a lot of the liver and the organs, where they're, the mammoth would be eating grass, so they'd get some nutrients if they're eating the raw intestines and the liver and organs, but not very much. So you're going to get a lot of pathological problems as well from doing something like that. They can survive. They drink milk. They would have to, right? So they would have to have the ability to drink milk. So I'm not sure what their lactose ability was, but I bet you if we look into it, they were able to digest milk, because it's one of those things that they would have had to do in a very harsh condition. Well, guess what? Drinking lots of milk, what does that do to your bones? What do we know about people in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, where a high concentration of their diet is dairy? Well, thicker bones, right? Strong system. So now all of a sudden they don't have a lot of vitamin D, but what's going on? You can't build a lot of bones, right, without a lot of vitamin D. So what's going on? There's an ice age, right? Well, they can drink milk for it. So there you go. They're eating lots of meat. They're drinking milk, and they're consuming hopefully some intestinal organs from these animals that they're killing. And then they have the ability to have the mammoth around, so they can make clothing out of their things, just like you would from a deer or a buffalo. And then all of a sudden, now we have them inbreeding and migrating. So you're going to get the adaptations, not only from the temperature and the diet change, but the inbreeding as well. So those are 3 things affecting their pathologies, and what we're seeing in them being a little bit different from their ability to age, from living longer, from them being earlier people group, having more genetic diversity built into them. They have more also DNA. They have almost as much more DNA than the entire Y chromosome, which is 60 million base pairs. They had like 53 million more base pairs than people do today. So there was a lot more ability inside their genome to actually mutate. And what would happen? More recombinational hotspots, right? So they would mutate faster as well. Just like Africans have more PRDM9, so they have more mutations occurring in their system than the average European today. So therefore, they have more mutations as well. Well, guess what? Neanderthal and Denisovan also did, and they had a larger genome on top of it. So of course, they're going to have more mutations in them, and more diversity arise because of these things. So that was kind of long-winded. I could go more, but we have more to do. So let's move on. I think that's good enough right now.
Well, that was a great explanation. As you were talking there about the PRDM9 gene that helps with recombination, and Africans, the African population has more of these genes, which means a population with more PRDM9 sites can what? Harbor more genetic diversity. And I was going to pull up that paper where it talks about more diversity doesn't mean older population. It might mean more rounds of recombination. So the fact that African genetic diversity in Africa is more scrambled, does that mean that it's an older population, Matt, or has there just been more rounds of recombination?
If Africa was nuked by a bomb today and there was no Africa at all, no Africans or anything, right? But what people group now would be older? Well, it would be the people group that would have, again, more mutations in them. Well, what could be doing that? More recombination, right? So we would go to the Asian groups of people. They would look older to us than we are today. But we know for a fact now that mutation rates are different in different people groups. Matter of fact, they're different between even Europeans. And we know that now because Amish people mutate slower than other Europeans do. So think about that. So imagine there's nobody left except for just you and me and the generations that we have. In 10 generations from right now, they might test our great grandkids. And what would they discover? They would say, uh-oh, one of these lines is older than the other. It's existed before. But why? We're together right now, aren't we? So therefore, how could they get different results in 10 generations? The only way that could be possible is if there's a different mutation rate based on different generational times and also different recombination rates occurring inside of us right now and our generations to come.
So, with that being said, what if Africa, after Babel, right, and the post-Babel migration that took place around the globe, what if Africa was founded by a population with more working PRDM9 sites?
They would look older than everybody else.
Right.
Exactly. They would have to. And think about it. Where was the best place to live during that time? Well, Africa. It's tropical. Everywhere north is cold. Cold is harsh. Cold is no planting anything. You know, you don't get look at Africa today. There's still not really farming going on there, is it? What does farming do? You mentioned it earlier. Farming and agriculture allows for populations to get larger. Africa even today doesn't have that. So you're stuck with smaller populations of people, which is allowing fixations, or I should say mutations, substitutions, reaching fixation faster, which is what we see. Evolution assumes that there must be older because there's more fixations. We say, look, everything about them points to them having more mutations for so many reasons: smaller populations, lower generation time, faster recombination rates. That's exactly what we see even today. So since evolution believes in uniformitarianism, that today is the presence of the past, well, guess what? We can take what we see today and extrapolate into the past, and it still proves our point.
Right. Notice this on the screen. Matt, did you want to read through that?
Yeah. Studies of highly diverged species have revealed two mechanisms by which meiotic recombination is directed to the genome: through a PRDM9 binding or by targeting promoter-like features.
And right here.
Collectively, these actions determine patterns of genetic linkage and the possibilities for a chromosome reorganization or successive generations.
Exactly. PRDM9 influences the possibility of genetic exchange by determining the locations of meiotic recombination hotspots in most mammals. So again, on the topic of African genetic diversity, what if, so after Babel, you have all these migration events, right? Migration event after migration event. Some of these populations, subpopulations become isolated like Neanderthals. Now, what if we have waves and waves of migration into Africa post Babel? What would that do in terms of genetic differences and genetic diversity?
Oh, Africa would be the most genetically diverse place on Earth. And
Right.
it's exactly what we see. I mean, where today is the most genetically diverse people? It's the sands, and they're in South Africa. And when we go to South Africa, what do we see today in South Africa? It has the lowest generation time and the highest birth rates in all of Africa. I mean, can you get any better than that? What would you expect to see from a low generation time of people where the average age of birth is 15 to 18? You're going to have tons of generations. Matter of fact, they would have twice the amount of generations other people would have. So therefore, they would have twice the amount of mutations. That would make them look twice as old, right? That's exactly what you see in Africa. Once you leave Africa, now you have populations that wait even longer, 30, 40 years before having children. They have even less mutations in their population. So that's where that chart comes in.
So so if we look at the longest lines on a mitochondrial phylogeny or a phylogenetic or a Y chromosome phylogenetic tree, does that mean that the longer the branches are, the older the population is, Matt?
No, that's what's assumed. It's assumed that it's longer based on neutral theory, which is the evolutionary assumption that everything and everyone mutates at exactly the same rate everywhere on Earth. So because of that, there is no possible way that any other group of people can be older than Africans because Africans have more mutations. Therefore, they've concluded the out of Africa or the African origins of humanity.
Right. And not to mention, so for example, what we're looking at here is random mutations in people groups over time. And yet we find a pattern that fits exactly with what we would expect given the biblical creation model of ancestry, right? One woman, we have explosive growth from a center point, this starburst pattern. But these subgroups like this HVR, most common haplogroup in Europe, I believe, we have differing sizes in terms of the branch lengths. So what does that mean? We have people, right, picking up more mutations in the same amount of time, having more mutations than their cousins, which means you can't then assume the evolutionary molecular clock, right? Humans and chimpanzees split X number of years ago. There's this many differences. And then, they come up with a slow mutation rate. No, this means you can pick up more mutations in the same amount of time. What does that mean, Matt?
Well, you can pick up different amount of mutations in the same amount of time. It means that the entire phylogenetic chart based on evolution being true can just be discounted because
right.
Just garbage.
Exactly.
It's all like assumption. So take, for example, a bear, right? What bear is older on a phylogenetic chart? You're going to look down and you're going to go, oh, look, it's the panda. The panda is the oldest bear. Well, if a bear species got off the ark and it created all the bears that we have today, unless it was the panda, I mean, that's a possibility, but we don't really know what bear it was. But let's say it's dead and all of its descendants are alive today. How can we say that the panda is older when all the other species of bears came from it at the same time? Easy. Panda bears have a generation time of 4.5 years, one of the lowest of all bear species. So therefore, it should have many more generations, and that many more generations would mean that many more mutations, and that's exactly what we see. So again, a phylogenetic chart based off the assumption that more mutations mean it's older, based on neutral theory being true, can be discounted even looking at bears. It can be discounted looking at every species of life that you want.
Amen. Amen, brother. So many great points. So
matter of fact, I'm sorry, real quick, is I guess by saying that the panda bear is the oldest, evolution would assume that pandas are the first bear. Therefore, bears evolved in Japan. So how did all the other bears get out of there? Right? Do they swim to land and get out of there and learn the ability to digest everything else? See what I mean? Pretty bizarre concept, right? Our theory makes more sense.
Yeah.
You get the land bridges, you get them walking there. It's based on generational time. Sorry, I had to.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. And in our number of books, we touch on that, and we're going to be touching on that in even more detail in the future books that we're working on. And then we've also got a genetic boundary study the video that you're working on currently that I think is going to be awesome. But I want to, okay, so moving on then to back to patriarchal drive and how it applies to not only like African diversity, but also Neanderthal diversity. So we understand that when it comes to men, our reproductive cells start dividing at puberty, and they don't stop dividing until we die, right? And that is why older men essentially can have kids or children later in life. Now, if we have really old men, pre-flood obviously, but immediate post-flood, where men are still living into their hundreds of years old, we would have early biblical patriarchs that are having kids later in their lives. And therefore their kids, their offspring, are going to start off with a whole bunch of new mutations, right? Okay. So biblical patriarchs having kids means on a phylogenetic tree, when we manifest genetic diversity or mutations, random mutations in populations over time, we can get what? Very long branch lengths right at the beginning. Isn't that right, Matt?
Yep. And it immediately makes it look like deep time is more true, simply because there's a vast more mutations being added than we're adding today at our lower generation time, right? We're told today, don't have children after the age of 40. The reason why is because the chances of problems is worse, and it's even getting worse because there's more mutations being added to the population all the time. You rewind that, you have the exact opposite.
Right. I mean, it really is just fascinating. So that brings me to I'm gonna screen share, and we kind of touched on this. Actually, before I do, to kind of break it down to the audience and to you, we know that some critics, more militant critics, Dr. Dodgeball Dan, for example, one of them, he'll say that, well, you can't be hyper mutating and also inbred. Inbreeding reduces levels of heterozygosity. It results in less genetic diversity. Hypermutation, if you're a hypermutating people group, a mutation adds something. It adds genetic diversity because it's adding something that was not previously there. Isn't this a contradiction? Inbreeding and hypermutation. Okay. And we've discussed that in great detail. I've had formal debates on that question. Firstly, it assumes all nuclear DNA differences are the result of what? Mutations over time. The creationist holds to what's called created nuclear DNA heterozygosity, right? So for the autosomal DNA, we would essentially attribute DNA diversity and DNA differences to initial creation. That would be for the biparentally inherited DNA. But the uniparentally DNA inherited compartments like the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, we can agree with the evolutionists that differences in those compartments, the non-recombining compartments, are due to mutations. And so hypermutation may not be noticeable, okay, in the autosomal DNA because you have inbreeding, you have a reduction in heterozygosity and an increase in homozygosity. But you can have the uniparentally DNA inherited compartments like the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome significantly affected by hypermutation. Now, the hypermutation happening in a small population that's inbred, Matt, well, what's that going to do? You're still going to have deleterious mutations that are passed on and have a higher chance of what? Becoming fixated, right?
Yep.
So in Dr. Rob Carter's video here, titled Was Africa the Cradle of Humanity? I'd love to get your thoughts on some of this. I thought this was funny. This was a mic drop comment of 2022. I'll give it to Dr. Carter. So this Hannah here repeated all the arguments from Dan Carty now that we've addressed, right? And here's an interesting one. Well, let's go over the first two first, okay? patriarchal drive could not account for the mitochondrial diversity in Africa because men don't contribute any genetic information to mitochondria, because the mitochondrial DNA is passed on from maternally. We get it from our mothers, Y chromosome from our fathers. So let's go. Inbreeding decreases genotype frequencies, right? Less diverse populations. Inbreeding results in the deletion of mutant alleles from populations, not the other way around. But this is just repeating the arguments made in Dodgeball Dan's video. Effects of a change in the level of inbreeding on the genetic load by Barrett and Charlesworth. So I'm going to go over the first two. We'll get your thoughts, Matt. Dr. Rob Carter responds to each one. And that's the thing, when it comes to like the Gutsy Gibbons of the world, the Dan Cardinals of the world, you respond, you debunk their arguments. Matt, what do?
They just ask another question.
or they'll ask the same question, like in
a different way.
Right. They're not looking for an answer. They're not. So eventually you just have to kind of be like, okay, these people aren't actually looking for an answer. They're not looking for a sophisticated discussion, because you still see Dan repeat these arguments, right?
Yeah.
So everywhere. So firstly, Rob says, Dr. Carter says, matriarchal drive is also a thing, but I did not talk about it. Also, it is not clear that one can decouple mitochondrial DNA mutations from the nuclear genome. So here's an important one. Inbreeding results in the deletion of mutant alleles from populations, not the other way around. This is not true, Dr. Carter says. Inbreeding leads to genetic drift, which leads to general loss of genetic diversity. The probability of any variation being retained is proportional to its frequency in the population. I went over that in my presentation there. So yes, rare alleles are more easily lost, but random chance has a stronger role in small populations. So take the Neanderthals existing in small populations, essentially in tribes. They're inbreeding. Deleterious mutations in recessive form are being manifested, and they might have been hypermutating as well. So they're passing on more mutations from generation to generation, meaning even deleterious mutations can increase in frequency, even to the point of what? Fixation, to be stuck in place. Rapid rates of fixation, like we talk about, right, Matt? This is the whole reason we worry about endangered species. So do you see what happens when you repeat these arguments that have been debunked before, right? You're just repeating, as Dr. Carter pointed out, this is just false, essentially, going into why. What are your thoughts on that overall, brother?
Yeah, I saw that earlier too. I thought it was pretty funny that he directly answered him. And usually you get in these comment wars with these guys because they're just going to go, okay, well, I'll give you that, right? It's like, what do you mean give me that? You just spent all that time trying to debunk it and refute me. Now you're just completely okay with that answer? No, you're not, because you're just going to go somewhere else and repeat it all. And the first thing they said is that males can't pass mitochondria on. Yeah, well, guess what? That's outdated. We can actually. Ooh, surprise. But so they were wrong on their very first statement that they made. Sure, we don't pass on tons of it, but guess what? They actually discovered we do pass it on. How much? I'm not sure, but I could figure it out pretty quickly online. But you guys can type that in. Can males pass on mitochondria? And don't just read the first heading. Scroll down. You'll see all the new results that have been out since 2018. That's known that we're able to pass on mitochondria now. All that does is make the mutation rate faster, though, because it's heteroplasmy. And when you look inside of a human and you find that they have different types of mitochondria, that means there's different clocks ticking at all the different time. And when you add all 4 of them or more of them together, guess what? You have a faster clock now as well, because none of the clocks are not ticking at all. They're ticking at different rates. And when you combine them, well, guess what? We already have a fast clock. Can you imagine if they sped it up even more? Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. And that is exactly why there is such a huge problem with these evolutionists that still dodge the data. Well, I thought I had the, oh, there it is. This is not tens of thousands of mutations here. This is only a few mutations on average, between 20 and 25 between any two people, max 100 and 120 if we were to take a non-African and an African at most, but yet the mutation rate is high. The mutation rate is very fast. Right here, notice this. A more recent study demonstrated that mutations in the mitochondrial control region occur at a rate of 1 every other generation. Since Eve's mitochondrial sequence has been reconstructed and published in the evolutionary literature, and since most mitochondrial lines are less than 30 mutations removed from the Eve consensus sequence, so less than 30, and since the most divergent are only about, 100 mutations removed, the diversity of mitochondrial DNA within modern human populations can easily fit into a 6,000 year timescale. This is a problem. This is not tens of thousands of generations. This is not thousands of mutations. This is a few mutations. We're looking at a fast mutation rate, which means we can account for purifying selection. We can account for the necessary factors that go into this. And yet still far too few DNA differences for deep time evolution to be true. And I wanted to point this out, Matt. You'll get a kick out of this. I know you read it. Notice this. This is the worst argument ever. So the evolutionist says higher recombination can't account for the molecular clock and rate of SNP mutations, single nucleotide polymorphisms. So Dr. Rob Carter's response. Higher we just talked about this. This is why this is interesting. Higher recombination rates will lead to the preservation. So a population that has a higher recombination rate, say they got more of these PRDM9 sites, okay? More functioning and working DM9 sites, then that population is going to be able to harbor more genetic diversity. So notice this, higher recombination rates will lead to the preservation of more genetic diversity over time, making them appear older if you have evolutionary based assumptions, which are wrong, giving the appearance of an older population. But look at this. If two populations have dissimilar recombination rates, right? Let's say African populations, non-Africans, and the recombination rates are different in both. Their clocks will not necessarily tick at the same rate, especially if one population is small. Let's say you got one population, different, faster recombination rates, and it's smaller versus a larger population that has slower recombination rates, but there's different generation times, different things that we were talking about earlier that are important. Matt, go ahead, brother.
Yeah, it's going to be way different because a smaller population smaller population with faster recombination rate is going to really make them look old now. And now that we know, because we look inside the Y chromosome and we find mutation rates in them, and we find Neanderthal have more mutations in their Y chromosome, well, that's easy to test if we're related to them because we erase these mutations. And what do we find? Complete relation, right? We're going back to creation, and like what I said earlier, we're not going to creation. We're actually going to the flood bottleneck. So that means they had to live after the bottleneck. So that makes Neanderthal only 200,000 years or younger in the evolutionary model, which they would deny, or because remember, we came from them, at least the Europeans, or it means that the young earth creation model is true and they also came after the flood bottleneck. So either way, it actually answers it. The Y chromosome does. The mitochondria is messed up though, because what he said, they have different recombination rates and they have recombination happening in different places. So it looks like there's more mutations everywhere, not just where we have it, like in our recombinational hotspots, but also in other places because their genome's bigger. So they have their genome looks different. So people go, oh, they must not have been human. Well, they have a bigger genome. That right there is going to make them look different. So now you add mutations to those regions. Well, guess what? They're going to look really different now. And that is why they're different. So it's not really a confusion anymore. We just know how mutations make it appear as though lineages are older than others when they're not. They can't be.
Amen. Well said, brother. I mean, the evidence is overwhelmingly on our side. That's why we love genetics. It's the direct way to determine ancestry. A bone found in the dirt is not inherited sperm and egg. These fragments is low quality, low confidence data when it comes to the fossil record. No, genetics is genes and traits are inherited sperm and egg. Okay. It's the best way to answer this question of ancestry. And what have we done through genetics? We've essentially confirmed separate ancestry and refuted universal common ancestry. And now we're really getting into the important aspects of answering these important questions about different types of life. What is and what isn't related. We're getting into genetic boundaries right here for the audience sake. PRDM9 controls activation of mammalian recombination hotspots. Me and Matt went over that earlier. We have shown that PRDM9 alleles that bind a novel 17 BP motif and occur at greatly increased frequency. If people of West African ancestry have led to a shift in the recombination landscape compared with people of non-African ancestry, The larger number of hotspots available to West Africans implies that at the population level, crossovers are more evenly distributed than in Europeans, and thus the shorter extent of West African linkage disequilibrium is not due to differences in demographic history alone, such as the lack of an out of Africa founder effect. I wanted to just point this one out. Svante Pabo, he's done a ton of he's one of the world's leading experts on Neanderthals, and he points out we had by now shown that there had been mixing between Neanderthals and modern humans. I knew that taxonomic wars over Neanderthal classification would continue, since there is no definition of a species perfectly describing the case. Many would say that a species is a group of organisms that can produce fertile offspring with each other and cannot do so with members of other groups. From that perspective, we had shown that Neanderthals and modern humans were the what? The same species. And yeah, you'll find other paleoanthropologists that would disagree with that, because guess what, Matt? The field is contested, and no matter what you're looking at, there's going to be another paleoanthropologist that disagrees with that.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. If it was set in stone, there wouldn't be so much disagreement. But because there's no consensus, because they have so few fragments and so many disarticulated or broken to bit pieces that's mixed with other things, they can storytell all they want. And that's where evolution lives, in storytelling land. You know, that's all they've got. They've got those little pieces of puzzles, and they can try to jumble them all together. And that's where they can tell their stories. But genetics is what destroys them.
Amen. Hope, dream, and imagine. So that being said, brother, we're about to hit the 3-hour mark. And to the audience, I know this was a lot of information, and that was our goal. You know, we wanted this to be data-driven, information-packed. We wanted to leave no stone unturned. And I believe that is exactly what we have done. So share this content around. The truth is important. This topic is important. And we are going to be doing even more shows like this in the future. Of course, it takes a lot of time, energy, and work, as you know, day and night to put together these presentations, doing the research. The study alone is a full-time job. And we have a lot of projects, and we have a lot of goals for you in 2022. So if you want to support us, you can support us through the website, or currently we have something cool going on when it comes to Patreon. All new patrons will get 3 free PDFs of our multiple books that we've written. So we would appreciate the support. And we also appreciate just how engaging the chat always is. You guys are awesome. There's always great questions and feedback. So Matt, any final words, final thoughts from you, brother?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll make you guys your Patreons. And anybody that becomes a patron for you, I will make some custom videos that no one else will get to see for the public. I'll design some things for that. That'll be good. And also, if you guys want to see a new book review from Dr. Jensen's new book called Traced, one of our team members actually has read the book and wants to do a live review. And if you guys want to see that, leave a comment, and we'll have him on later. It's trying to convince him to do it. So that should be a good one. So let us know on that. And I guess we're done, unless you want me to get that last question on the side.
Oh, yeah. Let's get it in. Let me put it up on screen, brother. I didn't even notice that. So
yeah, you had a member. One of your members, Power Word. He asked. Go ahead. You can read it better than me. I can't see this screen.
Genesis 10:5 states, "And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, because in his days the earth was divided." How does this fit into the discussion tonight?
Yeah, that's actually quite funny, because that is also in the book predicted by Dr. Jensen, who said that we should find the history of humanity in our genetics. And what we would expect to find if we looked at Noah, how many mutations would be passed on per generation until we land on that generation before we notice all of the haplogroups spreading across the world. And that was a prediction made by Dr. Jensen, that we would find it would land on Peleg's generation. So something that's going to be in the future video to come on the interview with Brandon. So fits in perfectly with it.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. We're really looking forward to Dr. Jeanson's new book. I just started getting into it in terms of the Kindle. And Brandon, one of our teammates here on Team Standing For Truth, he's been going through it for a couple months now. So he's got a really good idea in terms of its content and the confirmed predictions that has the evolutionary community running scared. So we're going to have him give a solid review and some feedback on it. So if you're not yet subscribed, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. And again, share around this content, as the truth is important. And one final reminder, the rescheduled debate between Dr. Dino and James W. is tomorrow night at 8 EST, 7 p.m. Central. And I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for tuning in. Matt and I are signing out. God bless all.